The 4:15 Express by Amelia B. Edwards. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Allerton, United Kingdom, 20th of April 2007. The 4:15 Express. The events which I am about to relate took place between 9 and 10 years ago. Sebastopol had fallen in the early spring, the Peace of Paris had been concluded since March, our commercial relations with the Russian Empire were but recently renewed, and I, returning home after my first northward journey since the war, was well pleased with the prospect of spending the month of December under the hospitable and thoroughly English roof of my excellent friend Jonathan Jelf, Esquire, of Dumbleton Manor, Clayborough, East Anglia. Travelling in the interests of the well-known firm in which it is my lot to be a junior partner, I had been called upon to visit not only the capitals of Russia and Poland, but had found it also necessary to pass some weeks among the trading ports of the Baltic, whence it came that the year was already far spent before I again set foot on English soil, and that instead of shooting pheasants with him as I had hoped in October, I came to be my friend's guest during the more genial Christmas tide. My journey over, and a few days given up to business in Liverpool and London, I hastened down to Clayborough with all the delight of a schoolboy whose holidays are at hand. My way lay by the great East Anglian line as far as Clayborough station, where I was to be met by one of the Dumbleton carriages and conveyed across the remaining 9 miles of country. It was a foggy afternoon, singularly warm for the 4th of December, and I had arranged to leave London by the 4:15 express. The early darkness of winter had already closed in, the lamps were lighted in the carriages, a clinging damp dimmed the windows, adhered to the door-handles, and pervaded all the atmosphere, while the gas-jets at the neighbouring book-stand diffused a luminous haze that only served to make the gloom of the terminus more visible. Having arrived some 7 minutes before the starting of the train, and by the connivance of the guard taken sole possession of an empty compartment, I lighted my travelling lamp, made myself particularly snug, and settled down to the undisturbed enjoyment of a book and a cigar. Great, therefore, was my disappointment, when at the last moment a gentleman came hurrying along the platform, glanced into my carriage, opened the locked door with a private key, and stepped in. It struck me at the first glance that I had seen him before, a tall, spare man, thin-lipped, light-eyed, with an ungraceful stoop in the shoulders, and scant grey hair worn somewhat long upon the collar. He carried a light waterproof coat, an umbrella, and a large brown japanned deed-box, which last he placed under the seat. This done, he felt carefully in his breast-pocket, as if to make certain of the safety of his purse or pocket-book, laid his umbrella in the netting overhead, spread the waterproof across his knees, and exchanged his hat for a travelling cap of some Scotch material. By this time the train was moving out of the station and into the faint grey of the wintry twilight beyond. I now recognized my companion. I recognized him from the moment when he removed his hat and uncovered the lofty, furrowed, and somewhat narrow brow beneath. I had met him, as I distinctly remembered, some 3 years before, at the very house for which, in all probability, he was now bound, like myself. His name was Dwerrihouse. He was a lawyer by profession, and, if I was not greatly mistaken, was first cousin to the wife of my host. I knew also that he was a man eminently well-to-do, both as regarded his professional and private means. The Jelfs entertained him with that sort of observant courtesy which falls to the lot of the rich relation. The children made much of him, and the old butler, albeit somewhat surly to the general, treated him with deference. I thought, observing him by the vague mixture of lamplight and twilight, that Mrs. Jelf's cousin looked all the worse for the 3 years' wear and tear which had gone over his head since our last meeting. He was very pale, and had a restless light in his eye that I did not remember to have observed before. The anxious lines, too, about his mouth were deepened, and there was a cavernous, hollow look about his cheeks and temples which seemed to speak of sickness or sorrow. He had glanced at me as he came in, but without any gleam of recognition in his face. Now he glanced again, as I fancied, somewhat doubtfully. When he did so for the 3rd or 4th time, I ventured to address him. "Mr. John Dwerrihouse, I think." "That is my name," he replied. "I had the pleasure of meeting you at Dumbleton about 3 years ago." Mr. Dwerrihouse bowed. "I thought I knew your face," he said, "but your name, I regret to say—" William Langford. "I have known Jonathan Jelf since we were boys together at Merchant Taylor's, and I generally spend a few weeks at Dumbleton in the shooting season. I suppose we are bound for the same destination." "Not if you are on your way to the Manor," he replied. "I am travelling upon business, rather troublesome business too, while you doubtless have only pleasure in view." "Just so. I am in the habit of looking forward to this visit as to the brightest 3 weeks in all the year." "It is a pleasant house," said Mr. Dwerrihouse. "The pleasantest I know. And Jelf is thoroughly hospitable, the best and kindest fellow in the world." "They have invited me to spend Christmas week with them," pursued Mr. Dwerrihouse after a moment's pause. "And you are coming?" "I cannot tell. It must depend on the issue of this business which I have in hand. You have heard, perhaps, that we are about to construct a branch line from Blackwater to Stockbridge." I explained that I had been away for some months away from England, and had therefore heard nothing of the contemplated improvement. Mr. Dwerrihouse smiled complacently. "It will be an improvement," he said, "a great improvement. Stockbridge is a flourishing town, and needs but a more direct railway communication with the metropolis to become an important centre of commerce. This branch was my own idea. I brought the project before the board, and have myself superintended the execution of it up to the present time." "You are an East Anglian director, I presume?" "My interest in the company," replied Mr. Dwerrihouse, "is threefold. I am a director, I am a considerable shareholder, and as head of the firm of Dwerrihouse and Craik, I am the company's principal solicitor." Loquacious, self-important, full of his pet project, and apparently unable to talk on any other subject, Mr. Dwerrihouse then went on to tell of the opposition he had encountered and the obstacles he had overcome in the cause of the Stockbridge branch. I was entertained with a multitude of local details and local grievances. The rapacity of one squire, the impracticability of another, the indignation of the rector whose glebe was threatened, the culpable indifference of the Stockbridge townspeople, who could not be brought to see that their most vital interests hinged upon a junction with the great East Anglian line, the spite of the local newspaper, and the unheard-of difficulties attending the common question, were each and all laid before me with a circumstantiality that possessed the deepest interest for my excellent fellow-traveller, but none whatever for myself. For these, to my despair, he went on to more intricate matters, to the approximate expenses of construction per mile, to the estimates sent in by different contractors, to the probable traffic returns of the new line, to the provisional clauses of the new Act as enumerated in Schedule D of the Company's last half-yearly report, and so on and on and on, till my head ached and my attention flagged, and my eyes kept closing in spite of every effort that I made to keep them open. At length I was roused by these words: £75,000 cash down. £75,000 cash down, I repeated, in the liveliest tone I could assume. That is a heavy sum. A heavy sum to carry here, replied Mr. Dwerrihouse, pointing significantly to his breast pocket, but a mere fraction of what we shall ultimately have to pay. You do not mean to say that you have £75,000 at this moment upon your person? I exclaimed. My good sir, have I not been telling you so for the last half-hour, said Mr. Dwerrihouse testily, That money has to be paid over at 8:30 this evening at the office of Sir Thomas's solicitors on completion of the deed of sale. But how will you get across by night from Blackwater to Stockbridge with £75,000 in your pocket?" "To Stockbridge," echoed the lawyer. "I find I have made myself very imperfectly understood. I thought I had explained how this sum only carries us as far as Mallingford, the first stage, as it were, of our journey, and how our route from Blackwater to Mallingford lies entirely through Sir Thomas Liddell's property." "I beg your pardon," I stammered. "I fear my thoughts were wandering. So you only go as far as Mallingford to-night?" "Precisely. I shall get a conveyance from the Blackwater Arms." "And you?" "Oh, Jelf sends a trap to meet me at Clayborough. Can I be the bearer of any message from you?" "You may say, if you please, Mr. Langford, that I wished I could have been your companion all the way, and that I will come over, if possible, before Christmas." "Nothing more?" Mr. Dwerrihouse smiled grimly. "Well," he said, "you may tell my cousin that she need not burn the hall down in my honour this time, and that I shall be obliged if she will order the blue room chimney to be swept before I arrive." "That sounds tragic. Had you a conflagration on the occasion of your last visit to Dumbleton?" "Something like it. There had been no fire lighted in my bedroom since the spring. The flue was foul, and the rooks had built in it. So when I went up to dress for dinner, I found the room full of smoke and the chimney on fire. Are we already at Blackwater?" The train had gradually come to a pause while Mr. Dwerrihouse was speaking, and on putting my head out of the window I could see the station some few hundred yards ahead. There was another train before us blocking the way, and the guard was making use of the delay to collect the Blackwater tickets. I had scarcely ascertained our position when the ruddy-faced official appeared at our carriage door. "Tickets, sir?" said he. "I am for Clayborough," I replied, holding out the tiny pink card. He took it, glanced at it by the light of his little lantern, gave it back, looked, as I fancied, somewhat sharply at my fellow-traveller, and disappeared. "He did not ask for yours," I said, with some surprise. "They never do," replied Mr. Dwerrihouse. "They all know me, and of course I travel free." "Blackwater, Blackwater!" cried the porter, running along the platform beside us as we glided into the station. Mr. Dwerrihouse pulled out his deed-box, put his travelling cap in his pocket, resumed his hat, took down his umbrella, and prepared to be gone. "Many thanks, Mr. Langford, for your society," he said, with old-fashioned courtesy. "I wish you a good evening." "Good evening," I replied, putting out my hand. But he either did not see it or did not choose to see it, and slightly lifting his hat, stepped out upon the platform. Having done this, he moved slowly away and mingled with the departing crowd. Leaning forward to watch him out of sight, I trod upon something which proved to be a cigar-case. It had fallen, no doubt, from the pocket of his waterproof coat, and was made of dark Morocco leather, with a silver monogram upon the side. I sprang out of the carriage just as the guard came up to lock me in. "Is there 1 minute to spare?" I asked eagerly. "The gentleman who travelled down with me from town has dropped his cigar-case. He is not yet out of the station." "Just 1.5 minutes, sir," replied the guard. "You must be quick." I dashed along the platform as fast as my feet could carry me. It was a large station, and Mr. Dwerrihouse had by this time got more than half-way to the farther end. I, however, saw him distinctly, moving slowly with the stream. Then, as I drew nearer, I saw that he had met some friend, that they were talking as they walked, that they presently fell back somewhat from the crowd, and stood aside in earnest conversation. I made straight for the spot where they were waiting. There was a vivid gas-jet just above their heads, and the light fell full upon their faces. I saw both distinctly, the face of Mr. Dwerrihouse and the face of his companion. Running, breathless, eager as I was, getting in the way of porters and passengers, and fearful every instant lest I should see the train going on without me, I yet observed that the newcomer was considerably younger and shorter than the director, that he was sandy-haired, moustached, small-featured, and dressed in a close-cut suit of Scotch tweed. I was now within a few yards of them. I ran against a stout gentleman. I was nearly knocked down by a luggage truck. I stumbled over a carpet-bag. I gained the spot just as the driver's whistle warned me to return. To my utter stupefaction, they were no longer there. I had seen them but 2 seconds before, and they were gone. I stood still. I looked to right and left. I saw no sign of them in any direction. It was as if the platform had gaped and swallowed them. "There were 2 gentlemen standing here a moment ago," I said to a porter at my elbow. "Which way can they have gone?" "I saw no gentlemen, sir," replied the man. The whistle shrilled out again. The guard, far up the platform, held up his arm and shouted to me to "come on." "If you're going on by this train, sir," said the porter, "you must move. You must run for it." I did run for it, just gained the carriage as the train began to move, was shoved in by the guard, and left, breathless and bewildered, with Mr. Dwerrihouse's cigar-case still in my hand. It was the strangest disappearance in the world. It was like a transformation trick in a pantomime. They were there one moment, palpably there, walking, with the gaslight full upon their faces, and the next moment they were gone. There was no door near, no window, no staircase. It was a mere slip of barren platform, tapestried with big advertisements. Could anything be more mysterious? It was not worth thinking about, and yet for my life I could not help pondering upon it, pondering, wondering, conjecturing, turning it over and over in my mind, and beating my brains for a solution of the enigma. I thought of it all the way from Blackwater to Clayborough. I thought of it all the way from Clayborough to Dumbleton, as I rattled along the smooth highway in a trim dog-cart, drawn by a splendid black mare, and driven by the silentest and dapperest of East Anglian grooms. We did the 9 miles in something less than an hour, and pulled up before the lodge gates just as the church clock was striking 7:30. A couple of minutes more, and the warm glow of the lighted hall was flooding out upon the gravel. A hearty grasp was on my hand, and a clear, jovial face was bidding me welcome to Dumbleton. "And now, my dear fellow," said my host, when the first greeting was over, "you have no time to spare. We dine at 8, and there are people coming to meet you, so you must just get the dressing business over as quickly as you may be. By the way, you will meet some acquaintances. The Biddulphs are coming, and Prendergast of the Skirmishers, is staying in the house. Adieu. Mrs. Jelf will be expecting you in the dining-room." I was ushered to my room, not the blue room of which Mr. Dwerrihouse had made disagreeable experience, but a pretty little bachelor's chamber, hung with a delicate chintz, and made cheerful by a blazing fire. I unlocked my portmanteau. I tried to be expeditious, but the memory of my railway adventure haunted me. I could not get free of it. I could not shake it off. It impeded me, worried me. It tripped me up. It caused me to mislay my studs, to mistie my cravat, to wrench the buttons off my gloves. Worst of all, it made me so late that the party had all assembled before I reached the drawing-room. I had scarcely paid my respects to Mrs. Jelf when dinner was announced, and we paired off, some 8 or 10 couples strong, into the dining-room. I am not going to describe either the guests or the dinner. All provincial parties bear the strictest family resemblance, and I am not aware that an East Anglian banquet offers any exception to the rule. There was the usual country baronet and his wife. There were the usual country parsons and their wives. There was the sempiternal turkey and haunch of venison. Vanitas vanitatum. There is nothing new under the sun. I was placed about midway down the table. I had taken one rector's wife down to dinner, and I had another at my left hand. They talked across me, and their talk was about babies. It was dreadfully dull. At length there came a pause. The entrees had just been removed, and the turkey had come upon the scene. The conversation had all along been of the languidest, but at this moment it happened to have stagnated altogether. Jelf was carving the turkey. Mrs. Jelf looked as if she was trying to think of something to say. Everybody else was silent. Moved by an unlucky impulse, I thought I would relate my adventure. "By the way, Jelf," I began, "I came down part of the way to-day with a friend of yours." "Indeed," said the master of the feast, slicing scientifically into the breast of the turkey. "With whom, pray?" "With one who bade me tell you that he should, if possible, pay you a visit before Christmas." "I cannot think who that could be," said my friend, smiling. "It must be Major Thorpe," suggested Mrs. Jelf. I shook my head. "It was not Major Thorpe," I replied. "It was a near relation of your own, Mrs. Jelf." "Then I am more puzzled than ever," replied my hostess. "Pray tell me who it was." "It was no less a person than your cousin, Mr. John Dwerrihouse." Jonathan Jelf laid down his knife and fork. Mrs. Jelf looked at me in a strange, startled way, and said never a word. "And he desired me to tell you, my dear madam, that you need not take the trouble to burn the hall down in his honour this time, but only to have the chimney of the blue room swept before his arrival." Before I had reached the end of my sentence, I became aware of something ominous in the faces of the guests. I felt I had said something which I had better have left unsaid, and that for some unexplained reason my words had evoked a general consternation. I sat confounded, not daring to utter another syllable, and for at least 2 whole minutes there was dead silence round the table. Then Captain Prendergast came to the rescue. "You have been abroad for some months, have you not, Mr. Langford?" he said, with the desperation of one who flings himself into the breach. "I heard you had been to Russia. Surely you had something to tell us of the state and temper of the country after the war?" I was heartily grateful to the gallant skirmisher for this diversion in my favour. I answered him, I fear, somewhat lamely, but he kept the conversation up, and presently 1 or 2 others joined in, and so the difficulty, whatever it might have been, was bridged over. Bridged over, but not repaired. A something, an awkwardness, a visible constraint remained. The guests hitherto had been simply dull, but now they were evidently uncomfortable and embarrassed. The dessert had scarcely been placed upon the table when the ladies left the room. I seized the opportunity to select a vacant chair near Captain Prendergast. "In heaven's name," I whispered, "what was the matter just now? What had I said?" "You mentioned the name of John Dwerrihouse." "What of that? I had seen him not 2 hours before." "It is a most astounding circumstance that you should have seen him," said Captain Prendergast. "Are you sure it was he?" "As sure as of my own identity. We were talking all the way between London and Blackwater. But why does that surprise you?" "Because," replied Captain Prendergast, dropping his voice to the lowest whisper, "because John Dwerrihouse absconded 3 months ago with £75,000 of the company's money, and has never been heard of since." John Dwerrihouse had absconded 3 months ago, and I had seen him only a few hours back. John Dwerrihouse had embezzled £75,000 of the company's money, yet told me that he carried that sum upon his person. Were ever facts so strangely incongruous, so difficult to reconcile? How should he have ventured again into the light of day? How dared he show himself along the line? Above all, what had he been doing throughout those mysterious 3 months of disappearance? Perplexing questions these, questions which at once suggested themselves to the minds of all concerned, but which admitted of no easy solution. I could find no reply to them. Captain Prendergast had not even a suggestion to offer. Jonathan Jelf, who seized the first opportunity of drawing me aside and learning all that I had to tell, was more amazed and bewildered than either of us. He came to my room that night when all the guests were gone, and we talked the thing over from every point of view, without, it must be confessed, arriving at any kind of conclusion. "I do not ask you," he said, "whether you can have mistaken your man. That is impossible. As impossible as that I should mistake some stranger for myself. It is not a question of looks or voice, but of facts. That he should have alluded to the fire in the blue room is proof enough of John Dwerrihouse's identity. How did he look?" "Older, I thought, considerably older, paler, and more anxious." "He has had enough to make him look anxious anyway," said my friend gloomily, "be he innocent or guilty." "I am inclined to believe that he is innocent," I replied. "He showed no embarrassment when I addressed him, and no uneasiness when the guard came round. His conversation was open to a fault. I might almost say that he talked too freely of the business which he had in hand." That again is strange, for I know no one more reticent on such subjects. He actually told you that he had the £75,000 in his pocket? He did. My wife has an idea about it, and she may be right. What idea? Well, she fancies, women are so clever, you know, at putting themselves inside people's motives, she fancies that he was tempted, that he did actually take the money, and that he has been concealing himself these 3 months in some wild part of the country, struggling possibly with his conscience all the time, and daring neither to abscond with his booty nor to come back and restore it. But now that he has come back, that is the point. She conceives that he has probably thrown himself upon the company's mercy, made restitution of the money, and being forgiven is permitted to carry the business through as if nothing whatever had happened. The last, I replied, is an impossible case. Mrs. Jelf thinks like a generous and delicate-minded woman, but not in the least like a board of railway directors. They would never carry forgiveness so far. I fear not, and yet it is the only conjecture that bears a semblance of likelihood. However, we can run over to Clayborough tomorrow and see if anything is to be learned. By the way, Prendergast tells me you picked up his cigar-case. I did so, and here it is. Jelf took the cigar-case, examined it by the light of the lamp, and said at once that it was beyond doubt Mr. Dwerrihouse's property, and that he remembered to have seen him use it. Here, too, is his monogram on the side, he added, a big J transfixing a capital D. He used to carry the same on his note-paper. It offers at all events a proof that I was not dreaming. Aye, but it is time you were asleep and dreaming now. I am ashamed to have kept you up so long. Good night. Good night, and remember that I am more than ready to go with you to Clayborough or Blackwater or London or anywhere, if I can be of the least service. Thanks. I know you mean it, old friend, and it may be that I shall put you to the test. Once more, good night. So we parted for that night, and met again in the breakfast-room at 8:30 next morning. It was a hurried, silent, uncomfortable meal. None of us had slept well, and all were thinking of the same subject. Mrs. Jelf had evidently been crying. Jelf was impatient to be off, and both Captain Prendergast and myself felt ourselves to be in the painful position of outsiders who were involuntarily brought into a domestic trouble. Within 20 minutes after we had left the breakfast-table, the dog-cart was brought round, and my friend and I were on the road to Clayborough. "Tell you what it is, Longford," he said, as we sped along between the wintry hedges. "I had not much fancy to bring up Dwerrihouse's name at Clayborough. All the officials know that he is my wife's relation, and the subject just now is hardly a pleasant one. If you don't much mind, we will make the 11:10 to Blackwater. It's an important station, and we shall stand a far better chance of picking up information there than at Clayborough." So we took the 11:10, which happened to be an express, and arriving at Blackwater about 12:15, proceeded at once to prosecute our inquiry. We began by asking for the station-master, a big, blunt, business-like person who at once averred that he knew Mr. John Dwerrihouse perfectly well, and that there was no director on the line whom he had seen and spoken to so frequently. "He used to be down here 2 or 3 times a week about 3 months ago," he said, "when the new line was first set afoot, but since then, you know, gentlemen—" He paused significantly. Jelf flushed scarlet. "Yes, yes," he said hurriedly, "we know all about that. The point now to be ascertained is whether anything has been seen or heard of him lately." "Not to my knowledge," replied the station-master. "He is not known to have been down the line any time yesterday, for instance." The station-master shook his head. "The East Anglian, sir," said he, "is about the last place where he would dare to show himself. Why, there isn't a station-master, there isn't a guard, there isn't a porter who doesn't know Mr. Dwerrihouse by sight as well as he knows his own face in the looking-glass, and who wouldn't telegraph for the police as soon as he had set eyes on him at any point along the line. Bless you, sir, there's been a standing order out against him ever since the 25th of September last." "And yet," pursued my friend, "a gentleman who travelled down yesterday from London to Clayborough by the afternoon express testifies that he saw Mr. Dwerrihouse in the train, and that Mr. Dwerrihouse alighted at Blackwater station." "Quite impossible, sir," replied the station-master promptly. "Why impossible?" "Because there is no station along the line where he is so well known, or where he would run so great a risk. It would be just running his head into the lion's mouth. He would have been mad to come nigh Blackwater station, and if he had come he would have been arrested before he left this platform." "Can you tell me who took the Blackwater tickets of that train?" "I can, sir. It was the guard, Benjamin Somers." "And where can I find him?" "You can find him, sir, by staying here, if you please, till 1 o'clock. He will be coming through with the up express from Crampton, which stays in Blackwater for 10 minutes. We waited for the up express, beguiling the time as best we could by strolling along the Blackwater road till we came almost to the outskirts of the town, from which the station was distant nearly a couple of miles. By 1 o'clock we were back again upon the platform and waiting for the train. It came punctually, and I at once recognized the ruddy-faced guard who had gone down with my train the evening before. "The gentlemen want to ask you something about Mr. Dwerrihouse, Somers," said the station-master, by way of introduction. The guard flashed a keen glance from my face to Jelf's and back again to mine. "Mr. John Dwerrihouse, the late director?" said he, interrogatively. "The same," replied my friend. "Should you know him if you saw him?" "Anywhere, sir." "Do you know if he was in the 4:15 express yesterday afternoon?" "He was not, sir." "How can you answer so positively?" "Because I looked into every carriage and saw every face in that train, and I could take my oath that Mr. Dwerrihouse was not in it. This gentleman was," he added, turning sharply upon me. "I don't know that I ever saw him before in my life, but I remember his face perfectly. You nearly missed taking your seat in time at this station, sir, and you got out at Clayborough." "Quite true, guard," I replied. "But do you not remember the face of the gentleman who travelled down in the same carriage with me as far as here?" "It was my impression, sir, that you travelled down alone," said Somers, with a look of some surprise. "By no means. I had a fellow-traveller as far as Blackwater, and it was in trying to restore him the cigar-case which he had dropped in the carriage that I so nearly let you go without me." "I remember your saying something about a cigar-case, certainly," replied the guard. "But—" "You asked for my ticket just before we entered the station." "I did, sir." "Then you must have seen him. He sat in the corner next the very door to which you came." "No, indeed, I saw no one." I looked at Jelf. I began to think the guard was in the ex-director's confidence, and paid for his silence. "If I had seen another traveller, I should have asked for his ticket," added Somers. "Did you see me ask for his ticket, sir?" I observed that you did not ask for it, but he explained that by saying I hesitated, I feared I might be telling too much, and so broke off abruptly. The guard and the station-master exchanged glances. The former looked impatiently at his watch. "I am obliged to go in 4 minutes more, sir," he said. "One last question, then," interposed Jelf, with a sort of desperation. "If this gentleman's fellow-traveller had been Mr. John Dwerrihouse, and he had been sitting in the corner next the door in which you took the tickets, could you have failed to see and recognize him?" "No, sir. It would have been quite impossible." "And you are certain you did not see him?" "As I said before, sir, I could take my oath I did not see him. And if it wasn't that I don't like to contradict a gentleman, I would say I could also take my oath that this gentleman was quite alone in the carriage the whole way from London to Clayborough. Why, sir," he added, dropping his voice so as to be inaudible to the station-master, who had been called away to speak to some person close by, "you expressly asked me to give you a compartment to yourself, and I did so. I locked you in, and you were so good as to give me something for myself." "Yes, but Mr. Dwerrihouse had a key of his own." "I never saw him, sir. I saw no one in that compartment but yourself. Beg pardon, sir, my time's up." And with this the ruddy guard touched his cap and was gone. In another minute the heavy panting of the engine began afresh, and the train glided slowly out of the station. We looked at each other for some moments in silence. I was the first to speak. "Mr. Benjamin Somers knows more than he chooses to tell," I said. "You think so?" "It must be. He could not have come to the door without seeing him. It's impossible." "There is one thing not impossible, my dear fellow." "What is that?" "That you may have fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing." Could I dream of a branch line that I had never heard of? Could I dream of 101 business details that had no kind of interest for me? Could I dream of the £75,000? Perhaps you might have seen or heard some vague account of the affair while you were abroad. It might have made no impression upon you at the time, and might have come back to you in your dreams, recalled perhaps by the mere names of the stations on the line. What about the fire in the chimney of the Blue Room? Should I have heard of that during my journey? Well, no, I admit there is a difficulty about that point. And what about the cigar case? Aye, by Jove, there is the cigar case. That is a stubborn fact. Well, it's a mysterious affair, and it will need a better detective than myself, I fancy, to clear it up. I suppose we may as well go home. A week had not gone by when I received a letter from the Secretary of the East Anglian Railway Company requesting the favour of my attendance at a special board meeting not then many days distant. No reasons were alleged, and no apologies offered for this demand upon my time, but they had heard, it was clear, of my inquiries anent the missing director, and had a mind to put me through some sort of official examination upon the subject. Being still a guest at Dumbleton Hall, I had to go up to London for the purpose, and Jonathan Jelf accompanied me. I found the direction of the Great East Anglian line represented by a party of some 12 or 15 gentlemen seated in solemn conclave round a huge green baize table in a gloomy boardroom adjoining the London terminus. Being courteously received by the chairman, who at once began by saying that certain statements of mine respecting Mr. John Dwerrihouse had come to the knowledge of the direction, and that they in consequence desired to confer with me on these points, we were placed at the table, and the inquiry proceeded in due form. I was first asked if I knew Mr. John Dwerrihouse, how long I had been acquainted with him, and whether I could identify him at sight. I was then asked when I had seen him last, to which I replied, on the 4th of this present month, December 1856. Then came the inquiry of where I had seen him on that 4th day of December, to which I replied that I had met him in a first-class compartment of the 4:15 down express, that he had got in just as the train was leaving the London terminus, and that he alighted at Blackwater station. The chairman then inquired whether I had held any communication with my fellow-traveller, whereupon I related, as nearly as I could remember it, the whole bulk and substance of Mr. John Dwerrihouse's diffuse information respecting the new branch line. To all this the board listened with profound attention, while the chairman presided and the secretary took notes. I then introduced the cigar case. It was passed from hand to hand, and recognized by all. There was not a man present who did not remember that plain cigar case with its silver monogram, or to whom it seemed anything less entirely corroborative of my evidence. When at length I had told all that I had to tell, the chairman whispered something to the secretary touched a silver handbell, and the guard, Benjamin Summers, was ushered into the room. He was then examined as carefully as myself. He declared that he knew Mr. John Dwerrihouse perfectly well, that he could not be mistaken in him, that he remembered going down with the 4:15 express on the afternoon in question, that he remembered me, and that there being 1 or 2 empty first-class compartments on that special afternoon, he had, in compliance with my request, placed me in a carriage by myself. He was positive that I remained alone in that compartment all the way from London to Clayborough. He was ready to take his oath that Dwerrihouse was neither in that carriage with me nor in any compartment of that train. He remembered distinctly to have examined my ticket to Blackwater, was certain that there was no one else at that time in the carriage, could not have failed to observe a second person if there had been one. Had that second person been Mr. John Dwerrihouse, should have quietly double-locked the door of the carriage, and have at once given information to the Blackwater station-master. So clear, so decisive, so ready was Summers with this testimony, the board looked fairly puzzled. "You hear this person's statement, Mr. Langford," said the chairman. "It contradicts yours in every particular. What have you to say in reply?" I can only repeat what I said before. I am quite as positive of the truth of my own assertions as Mr. Somers can be of the truth of his. You say that Mr. Dwerrihouse alighted at Blackwater, and that he was in possession of a private key. Are you sure that he had not alighted by means of that key before the guard came round for the tickets? I am quite positive that he did not leave the carriage till the train had fairly entered the station, and the other Blackwater passengers alighted. I even saw that he was met there by a friend. Indeed. Did you see that person distinctly? Quite distinctly. Can you describe his appearance? I think so. He was short and very slight, sandy-haired, with a bushy moustache and beard, and he wore a closely fitting suit of grey tweed. His age I should take to be about 38 or 40. Did Mr. Dwerrihouse leave the station in this person's company? I cannot tell. I saw them walking together down the platform, and then I saw them standing inside under a gas-jet, talking earnestly. After that I lost sight of them quite suddenly, and just then my train went on, and I with it. The chairman and secretary conferred together in an undertone. The directors whispered to one another. One or two looked suspiciously at the guard. I could see that my evidence remained unshaken, and that like myself, they suspected some complicity between the guard and the defaulter. How far did you conduct the 4:15 express on the day in question, Somers? Asked the chairman. All through, sir, replied the guard, from London to Crampton. How was it that you were not relieved at Clayborough? I thought there was always a change of guards at Clayborough. There used to be, sir, till the new regulations came in force last midsummer, since when the guards in charge of express trains go the whole way through. The chairman turned to the secretary. I think it would be as well, he said, if we had the day-book to refer to upon this point. Again the secretary touched the silver handbell, and desired the porter in attendance to summon Mr. Raikes. From a word or two dropped by another of the directors, I gathered that Mr. Raikes was one of the under-secretaries. He came, a small, slight, sandy-haired, keen-eyed man, with an eager, nervous manner, and a forest of light beard and moustache. He showed himself at the door of the board-room, and being requested to bring a certain day-book from a certain shelf in a certain room, bowed and vanished. He was there such a moment, and the surprise of seeing him was so great and sudden, that it was not till the door had closed upon him that I found voice to speak. He was no sooner gone, however, than I sprang to my feet. That person, I said, is the same who met Mr. Dwerrihouse upon the platform at Blackwater. There was a general movement of surprise. The chairman looked grave and somewhat agitated. "Take care, Mr. Langford," he said. "Take care what you say." "I am as positive of his identity as of my own." "Do you consider the consequences of your words? Do you consider that you are bringing a charge of the gravest character against one of the company's servants?" "I am willing to put it upon my oath, if necessary. The man who came to that door a minute since is the same whom I saw talking with Mr. Dwerrihouse on the Blackwater platform. Were he 20 times the company's servant, I could say neither more nor less." The chairman turned again to the guard. "Did you see Mr. Raikes in the train or on the platform?" he asked. Somers shook his head. "I am confident Mr. Raikes was not in the train," he said, "and I certainly did not see him on the platform." The chairman turned next to the secretary. "Mr. Raikes is in your office, Mr. Hunter," he said. "Can you remember if he was absent on the 4th instant?" "I do not think he was," replied the secretary, "but I am not prepared to speak positively. I have been away most afternoons myself lately, and Mr. Raikes might easily have absented himself if he had been disposed." At this moment the under-secretary returned with the day-book under his arm. "Be pleased to refer, Mr. Raikes," said the chairman, "to the entries of the 4th instant, and see what Benjamin Somer's duties were on that day." Mr. Raikes threw open the cumbrous volume, and ran a practised eye and finger down some 3 or 4 successive columns of entries. Stopping suddenly at the foot of a page, he then read aloud that Benjamin Somers had on that day conducted the 4:15 express from London to Crampton. The chairman leaned forward in his seat, looked the Under-Secretary full in the face, and said, quite sharply and suddenly, "Where were you, Mr. Raikes, on the same afternoon?" "I, sir?" "You, Mr. Raikes, where were you on the afternoon and evening of the 4th of the present month?" "Here, sir, in Mr. Hunter's office. Where else should I be?" There was a dash of trepidation in the Under-Secretary's voice as he said this, but his look of surprise was natural enough. "We have some reason for believing, Mr. Raikes, that you were absent that afternoon without leave. Was this the case?" "Certainly not, sir. I have not had a day's holiday since September. Mr. Hunter will bear me out in this." Mr. Hunter repeated what he had previously said on the subject, but added that the clerks in the adjoining office would be certain to know. Whereupon the senior clerk, a grave, middle-aged person in green glasses, was summoned and interrogated. His testimony cleared the Under-Secretary at once. He declared that Mr. Raikes had in no instance, to his knowledge, been absent during office hours since his return from his annual holiday in September. I was confounded. The chairman turned to me with a smile in which a shade of covert annoyance was scarcely apparent. "You hear, Mr. Langford?" he said. "I hear, sir, but my conviction remains unshaken." "I fear, Mr. Langford, that your convictions are very insufficiently based," replied the chairman with a doubtful cough. "I fear that you dream dreams, and mistake them for actual occurrences. It is a dangerous habit of mind, and might lead to dangerous results. Mr. Raikes here would have found himself in an unpleasant position had he not proved so satisfactory an alibi." I was about to reply, but he gave me no time. "I think, gentlemen," he went on to say, addressing the board, "that we should be wasting time to push this inquiry further. Mr. Langford's evidence would seem to be of an equal value throughout. The testimony of Benjamin Somers disproves his first statement, and the testimony of the last witness disproves his second. I think we may conclude that Mr. Langford fell asleep on the train on the occasion of his journey to Clayborough, and dreamed an unusually vivid and circumstantial dream, of which, however, we have now heard quite enough." There are few things more annoying than to find one's positive convictions met with incredulity. I could not help feeling impatience at the turn that affairs had taken. I was not proof against the civil sarcasm of the chairman's manner. Most intolerable of all, however, was the quiet smile lurking about the corners of Benjamin Somers' mouth, and the half-triumphant, half-malicious gleam in the eyes of the Under-Secretary. The man was evidently puzzled and somewhat alarmed. His looks seemed furtively to interrogate me. Who was I? What did I want? Why had I come there to do him an ill turn with his employers? What was it to me whether or no he was absent without leave? Seeing all this, and perhaps more irritated by it than the thing deserved, I begged leave to detain the attention of the board for a moment longer. Jelf plucked me impatiently by the sleeve. "Better let the thing drop," he whispered. "The chairman's right enough. You dreamed it, and the less said now the better." I was not to be silenced, however, in this fashion. I had yet something to say, and I would say it. It was to this effect, that dreams were not usually productive of tangible results, and that I requested to know in what way the chairman conceived I had evolved from my dream so substantial and well-made a delusion as the cigar case which I had had the honour to place before him at the commencement of our interview. "The cigar case, I admit, Mr. Langford," the chairman replied, "is a very strong point in your evidence. It is your only strong point, however, and there is just a possibility that we may all be misled by a mere accidental resemblance. Will you permit me to see the case again?" "It is unlikely," I said, as I handed it to him, "that any other should bear precisely this monogram, and yet be in all other particulars exactly similar." The chairman examined it for a moment in silence, and then passed it to Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter turned it over and over, and shook his head. "This is no mere resemblance," he said. "It is John Dwerrihouse's cigar case to a certainty. I remember it perfectly. I have seen it 100 times. "I believe I may say the same," added the chairman. "Yet how account for the way in which Mr. Langford asserts that it came into his possession?" "I can only repeat," I replied, "that I found it on the floor of the carriage after Mr. Dwerrihouse had alighted. It was in leaning out to look after him that I trod upon it, and it was in running after him for the purpose of restoring it that I saw, or believed I saw, Mr. Raikes standing aside with him in earnest conversation." Again I felt Jonathan Jelf plucking at my sleeve. "Look at Raikes," he whispered. "Look at Raikes." I turned to where the Under-Secretary had been standing a moment before, and saw him, white as death, with lips trembling and livid, stealing toward the door. To conceive a sudden, strange, and indefinite suspicion, to fling myself in his way, to take him by the shoulders as if he were a child, and turn his craven face perforce toward the board, were with me the work of an instant. "Look at him," I exclaimed. "Look at his face. I ask no better witness to the truth of my words." The chairman's brow darkened. "Mr. Raikes," he said sternly, "if you know anything, you had better speak." Vainly trying to wrench himself from my grasp, the Under-Secretary stammered out an incoherent denial. "Let me go," he said. "I know nothing. You have no right to detain me. Let me go." "Did you, or did you not, meet Mr. John Dwerrihouse at Blackwater Station? The charge brought against you is either true or false. If true, you will do well to throw yourself upon the mercy of the board, and make full confession of all that you know." The Under-Secretary wrung his hands in an agony of helpless terror. "I was away," he cried. "I was 200 miles away at the time. I know nothing about it. I have nothing to confess. I am innocent. I call God to witness I am innocent." 200 miles away?" echoed the chairman. "What do you mean?" "I was in Devonshire. I had 3 weeks' leave of absence. I appealed to Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter knows I had 3 weeks' leave of absence. I was in Devonshire all the time. I can prove I was in Devonshire." Seeing him so abject, so incoherent, so wild with apprehension, the directors began to whisper gravely among themselves, where one got quietly up and called the porter to guard the door. "What has your being down in Devonshire to do with the matter?" said the chairman. "Where were you in Devonshire?" "Mr. Raikes took his leave in September," said the secretary, "about the time when Mr. Dwerrihouse disappeared." "I have never heard that he had disappeared till I came back." "That must remain to be proved," said the chairman. "I shall at once put this matter in the hands of the police. In the meanwhile, Mr. Raikes, being myself a magistrate and used to deal with these cases, I advise you to offer no resistance, but to confess while confession may yet do you service. As for your accomplice—" The frightened wretch fell upon his knees. "I had no accomplice," he cried. "Only have mercy upon me, only spare my life, and I will confess all. I didn't mean to harm him. I didn't mean to hurt a hair of his head. Only have mercy upon me, and let me go." The chairman rose in his place, pale and agitated. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "What horrible mystery is this? What does it mean?" "As sure as there is a God in heaven," said Jonathan Jelf, "it means that murder has been done." "No, no, no!" shrieked Raikes, still upon his knees, and cowering like a beaten hound. "Not murder! No jury that ever sat could bring it in murder. I thought I had only stunned him. I never meant to do more than stun him. Manslaughter, not murder." Overcome by the horror of this unexpected revelation, the chairman covered his face with his hand, and for a moment or two remained silent. "Miserable man," he said at length, "you have betrayed yourself. You bade me confess. You urged me to throw myself upon the mercy of the board." "You have confessed to a crime which no one suspected you of having committed," replied the chairman, "and which this board has no power either to punish or forgive. All that I can do for you is to advise you to submit to the law, to plead guilty, and to conceal nothing. When did you do this deed?" The guilty man rose to his feet, and leaned heavily against the table. His answer came reluctantly, like the speech of one dreaming. "On the 22nd of September." On the 22nd of September. I looked in Jonathan Jelf's face, and he in mine. I felt my own smiling with a strange sense of wonder and dread. I saw his blanch suddenly, even to the lips. "Merciful heaven," he whispered. "What was it, then, that you saw in the train?" What was it that I saw in the train? That question remains unanswered to this day. I have never been able to reply to it. I only know that it bore the living likeness of the murdered man, whose body had then been lying some 10 weeks under a rough pile of branches and brambles and rotting leaves at the bottom of a deserted chalk pit about halfway between Blackwater and Mallingford. I know that it spoke and moved and looked as that man spoke and moved and looked in life, that I heard, or seemed to hear, things revealed which I could never otherwise have learned, that I was guided, as it were, by that vision on the platform to the identification of the murderer, and that a passive instrument myself, I was destined, by means of these mysterious teachings, to bring about the ends of justice. For these things I have never been able to account. As for that matter of the cigar case, it proved on inquiry that the carriage in which I travelled down that afternoon to Clayborough had not been in use for several weeks, and was, in point of fact, the same in which poor John Dwerrihouse had performed his last journey. The case had doubtless been dropped by him, and had lain unnoticed till I found it. Upon the details of the murder I have no need to dwell. Those who desire more ample particulars may find them, and the written confession of Augustus Raikes, in the files of the Times for 1856. Enough that the Under-Secretary, knowing the history of the new line, and following the negotiation step by step through all its stages, determined to waylay Mr. Dwerrihouse, rob him of the £75,000, and escape to America with his booty. In order to effect these ends, he obtained leave of absence a few days before the time appointed for the payment of the money, secured his passage across the Atlantic in a steamer advertised to start on the 23rd, provided himself with a heavily loaded life-preserver, and went down to Blackwater to await the arrival of his victim. How he met him on the platform with a pretended message from the board, how he offered to conduct him by a short cut across the fields to Mallingford, how, having brought him to a lonely place, he struck him down with the life-preserver, and so killed him, and how, finding what he had done, he dragged the body to the verge of an out-of-the-way chalk-pit, and there flung it in and piled it over with branches and brambles, are facts still fresh in the memories of those who, like the connoisseurs in De Quincey's famous essay, regard murder as a fine art. Strangely enough, the murderer, having done his work, was afraid to leave the country. He declared that he had not intended to take the director's life, but only to stun and rob him, and that finding the blow had killed, he dared not fly for fear of drawing down suspicion upon his own head. As a mere robber he would have been safe in the States, but as a murderer he would inevitably have been pursued and given up to justice. So he forfeited his passage, returned to the office as usual at the end of his leave, and locked up his ill-gotten thousands till a more convenient opportunity. In the meanwhile he had the satisfaction of finding that Mr. Dwerrihouse was universally believed to have absconded with the money, no one knew how or whither. Whether he meant murder or not, however, Mr. Augustus Raikes paid the full penalty of his crime, and was hanged at the Old Bailey in the second week in January 1857. Those who desire to make his further acquaintance may see him any day, admirably done in wax, in the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussaud's exhibition in Baker Street. He is there to be found in the midst of a select society of ladies and gentlemen of atrocious memory, dressed in the close-cut tweed suit which he wore on the evening of the murder, and holding in his hand the identical life-preserver with which he committed it. End of the 4:15 Express by Amelia B. Edwards.
The History of England by Jane Austen, read for LibriVox.org by Kiki Baessell, Kikala.org. The History of England, from the reign of Henry IV to the death of Charles I, by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. To Miss Austen, eldest daughter of the Reverend George Austen, this work is inscribed with all due respect by the author. In B, there will be very few dates in this history. The history of England. Henry IV. Henry IV ascended the throne of England, much to his own satisfaction, in the year 1399, after having prevailed on his cousin and predecessor, Richard II, to resign it to him and to retire for the rest of his life to Pomfret Castle, where he happened to be murdered. It is to be supposed that Henry was married, since he had certainly 4 sons, but it is not in my power to inform the reader who was his wife. Be this as it may, he did not live forever, but falling ill, his son, the Prince of Wales, came and took away the crown, whereupon the king made a long speech, for which I must refer the reader to Shakespeare's plays, and the prince made a still longer. Things being thus settled between them, the king died, and was succeeded by his son Henry, who had previously beat Sir William Gascoigne. Henry V. This prince, after he succeeded to the throne, grew quite reformed and amiable, forsaking all his dissipated companions, and never thrashing Sir William again. During his reign, Lord Cobham was burnt alive, but I forget what for. His Majesty then turned his thoughts to France, where he went and fought the famous battle of Agincourt. He afterwards married the king's daughter Catherine, a very agreeable woman by Shakespeare's account. In spite of all this, however, he died, and was succeeded by his son Henry. Henry VI. I cannot say much for this monarch's sins, nor would I if I could, for he was a Lancastrian. I suppose you know all about the wars between him and the Duke of York, who was of the right side. If you do not, you had better read some other history, for I shall not be very diffuse in this, meaning by it only to vent my spleen against, and show my hatred to all those people whose parties or principles do not suit with mine, and not to give information. This king married Margaret of Anjou, a woman whose distresses and misfortunes were so great as almost to make me who hate her pity her. It was in this reign that Joan of Arc lived and made such a row among the English. They should not have burnt her, but they did. There were several battles between the Yorkists and Lancastrians, in which the former, as they ought, usually conquered. At length they were entirely overcome. The king was murdered, the queen was sent home, and Edward IV ascended the throne. Edward IV. This monarch was famous only for his beauty and his courage, of which the picture we have here given of him, and his undaunted behavior in marrying one woman while he was engaged to another, are sufficient proofs. His wife was Elizabeth Woodville, a widow who, poor woman, was afterwards confined in a convent by that monster of iniquity and avarice, Henry VII. One of Edward's mistresses was Jane Shore, who has had a play written about her, but it is a tragedy and therefore not worth reading. Having performed all these noble actions, his Majesty died, and was succeeded by his son, Edward V. This unfortunate prince lived so little a while that nobody had time to draw his picture. He was murdered by his uncle's contrivance, whose name was Richard III. Richard III. The character of this prince has been in general very severely treated by historians, but as he was a York, I am rather inclined to suppose him a very respectable man. It has indeed been confidently asserted that he killed his 2 nephews and his wife, but it has also been declared that he did not kill his 2 nephews, which I am inclined to believe true. And if this is the case, it may also be affirmed that he did not kill his wife. For, if Perkin Warbeck was really the Duke of York, why not Lambert Simnel be the widow of Richard? Whether innocent or guilty, he did not reign long in peace, for Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, as great a villain as ever lived, made a great fuss about getting the crown, and having killed the king at the Battle of Bosworth, he succeeded to it. Henry VII. This monarch, soon after his accession, married the Princess Elizabeth of York, by which alliance he plainly proved that he thought his own right inferior to hers, though he pretended to the contrary. By this marriage he had 2 sons and 2 daughters, the elder of which daughters was married to the King of Scotland, and had the happiness of being grandmother to one of the first characters of the world, but of her I shall have occasion to speak more at large in future. The youngest, Mary, married first the King of France, and secondly the Duke of Suffolk, by whom she had 1 daughter, afterwards the mother of Lady Jane Grey, who, though inferior to her lovely cousin the Queen of Scots, was yet an amiable young woman, and famous for reading Greek while other people were hunting. It was in the reign of Henry VII that Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, before mentioned, made their appearance, the former of whom was set in the stocks, took shelter in Benliow Abbey, and was beheaded with the Earl of Warwick, and the latter was taken into the king's kitchen. His Majesty died, and was succeeded by his son Henry, whose only merit was his not being quite so bad as his daughter Elizabeth. Henry VIII. It would be an affront to my readers were I to suppose that they were not as well acquainted with the particulars of this king's reign as I am myself. I will therefore save them the task of reading again what they have read before, and myself the trouble of writing what I do not perfectly recollect, by giving only a slight sketch of the principal events which marked his reign. Among these may be ranked Cardinal Wolsey's telling the Father Abbot of Leicester Abbey that he was come to lay his bones among them, the Reformation in religion, and the King's riding through the streets of London with Anne Boleyn. It is, however, but justice and my duty to declare that this amiable woman was entirely innocent of the crimes with which she was accused, and of which her beauty, her elegance, and her sprightliness were sufficient proofs, not to mention her solemn protestations of innocence, the weakness of the charges against her, and the King's character, all of which add some confirmation, though perhaps but slight ones when in comparison with those before alleged in her favour. Though I do not profess giving many dates, yet as I think it proper to give some, and shall of course make the choice of those which it is most necessary for the reader to know, I think it right to inform him that her letter to the King was dated the 6th of May. The crimes and cruelties of this prince were too numerous to be mentioned, as this history, I trust, has fully shown, and nothing can be said in his vindication, but that his abolishing religious houses, and leaving them to the ruinous depredations of time, has been of infinite use to the landscape of England in general, which probably was a principal motive for his doing it, since otherwise, why should a man who was of no religion himself be at so much trouble to abolish one which had for ages been established in the kingdom? His Majesty's 5th wife was the Duke of Norfolk's niece, who, though universally acquitted of the crimes for which she was beheaded, has been by many people supposed to have led an abandoned life before her marriage. Of this, however, I have many doubts, since she was a relation of that noble Duke of Norfolk, who was so warm in the Queen of Scotland's cause, and who at last fell a victim to it. The King's last wife contrived to survive him, but with difficulty effected it. He was succeeded by his only son, Edward. Edward VI. As this prince was only 9 years old at the time of his father's death, he was considered by many people as too young to govern, and the late king happening to be of the same opinion, his mother's brother, the Duke of Somerset, was chosen protector of the realm during his minority. This man, on the whole, was a very amiable character, and is somewhat of a favourite with me, though I would by no means pretend to affirm that he was equal to those first of men, Robert, Earl of Essex, Delmere, or Gilpin. He was beheaded, of which he might with reason have been proud, had he known that such was the death of Mary Queen of Scotland, but as it was impossible that he should be conscious of what had never happened, it does not appear that he felt particularly delighted with the manner of it. After his decease, the Duke of Northumberland had the care of the king and the kingdom, and performed his trust of both so well that the king died, and the kingdom was left to his daughter-in-law, the Lady Jane Grey, who has already been mentioned as reading Greek. Whether she really understood that language, or whether such a study proceeded only from an excess of vanity, for which I believe she was always rather remarkable, is uncertain. Whatever might be the cause, she preserved in the same appearance of knowledge and contempt of what was generally esteemed to be pleasure during the whole of her life, for she declared herself displeased with being appointed queen, and while conducting to the scaffold, she wrote a sentence in Latin and another in Greek on seeing the dead body of her husband accidentally passing that way. Mary. This woman had the good luck of being advanced to the throne of England in spite of the superior pretensions, merit, and beauty of her cousins Mary Queen of Scotland and Jane Grey. Nor can I pity the kingdom for the misfortunes they experienced during her reign, since they fully deserved them, for having allowed her to succeed her brother, which was a double piece of folly, since they might have foreseen that as she died without children, she would be succeeded by that disgrace to humanity, that pest to society, Elizabeth. Many were the people who fell martyrs to the Protestant religion during her reign. I suppose not fewer than a dozen. She married Philip, King of Spain, who in her sister's reign was famous for building armadas. She died without issue, and then the dreadful moment came in which the destroyer of all comfort, the deceitful betrayer of trust, reposed in her, and the murderess of her cousin succeeded to the throne. Elizabeth. It was the peculiar misfortune of this woman to have bad ministers. Since, wicked as she herself was, she could not have committed such extensive mischief had not these vile and abandoned men connived at and encouraged her in her crimes. I know that it has by many people been asserted and believed that Lord Burleigh, Sir Francis Walsingham, and the rest who filled the chief offices of state were deserving, experienced, and able minister. But oh, how blinded such writers and such readers must be to merit despised, neglected, and defamed, if they can persist in such opinions when they reflect that these men, these boasted men, were such scandals to their country and their sex as to allow and assist their queen in confining for the space of 19 years a woman who, if the claims of relationship and merit were of no avail, yet as a queen and as one who condescended to place confidence in her, had every reason to expect assistance and protection, and at length in allowing Elizabeth to bring this amiable woman to an untimely, unmerited, and scandalous death. Can any one, if he reflects but for a moment on this blot, this everlasting blot upon their understanding and their character, allow any praise to Lord Burleigh or Sir Francis Walsingham? Oh, what must this bewitching princess, whose only friend was the Duke of Norfolk, and whose only ones now, Mr. Whitaker, Mrs. Leffery, Mrs. Knight, and myself, who was abandoned by her son, confined by her cousin, abused, reproached, and vilified by all, what must her most noble mind have suffered when informed that Elizabeth had given orders for her death? Yet she bore it with the most unshaken fortitude, firm in her mind, constant in her religion, and prepared herself to meet the cruel fate to which she was doomed with a magnanimity that would alone proceed from conscious innocence. And yet, could you, reader, have believed it possible that some hardened and zealous Protestants have even abused her for that steadfastness in Catholic religion which reflected on her so much credit? But this is a striking proof of their narrow souls and prejudiced judgments who accuse her. She was executed in the great hall at Fortheringay Castle, Sacred Place, on Wednesday, the 8th of February, 1586, to the everlasting reproach of Elizabeth, her ministers, and of England in general. It may not be unnecessary, before I entirely conclude my account of this ill-fated queen, to observe that she had been accused of several crimes during the time of her reigning in Scotland, of which I now most seriously do assure my reader that she was entirely innocent, having never been guilty of anything more than imprudencies into which she was betrayed by the openness of her heart, her youth, and her education. Having, I trust, by this assurance entirely done away with every suspicion and every doubt which might have arisen in the reader's mind, from what other historians have written of her, I shall proceed to mention the remaining events that marked Elizabeth's reign. It was about this time that Sir Francis Drake, the first English navigator who sailed around the world, lived to be the ornament of his country and his profession. Yet, great as he was, and justly celebrated as a sailor, I cannot help foreseeing that he will be equalled in this or the next century by one who, though now but young, already promises to answer all the ardent and sanguine expectations of his relations and friends, amongst whom I may class the amiable lady to whom this work is dedicated, and my no less amiable self. Though of a different profession and shining in a different sphere of life, yet equally conspicuous in the character of an earl, as Drake was in that of a sailor, was Robert Devereux, Lord of Essex. This unfortunate young man was not unlike in character to that equally unfortunate one, Frederick Delmere. The simile may be carried still farther, and Elizabeth, the torment of Essex, may be compared to Emmeline of Delmere. It would be endless to recount the misfortunes of this noble and gallant Earl. It is sufficient to say that he was beheaded on the 25th of February, after having been Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, after having clapped his hand on his sword, and after performing many other services to his country. Elizabeth did not long survive his loss, and died so miserable that were it not an injury to the memory of Mary, I should pity her. James I. Though this king had some faults, among which, and as the most principal, was his allowing his mother's death, yet considered on the whole, I cannot help liking him. He married Anne of Denmark, and had several children. Fortunately for him, his eldest son, Prince Henry, died before his father, or he might have experienced the evils which befell his unfortunate brother. As I am myself partial to the Roman Catholic religion, it is with infinite regret that I am obliged to blame the behaviour of any member of it. Yet truth being, I think, very excusable in a historian, I am necessitated to say that in this reign the Roman Catholics of England did not behave like gentlemen to the Protestants. Their behaviour indeed to the royal family and both houses of Parliament might justly be considered by them as very uncivil, and even Sir Henry Percy, though certainly the best bred man of the party, had none of that general politeness which is so universally pleasing, as his attentions were entirely confined to Lord Monteagle. Sir Walter Raleigh flourished in this and the preceding reign, and is by many people held in great veneration and respect. But as he was an enemy of the noble Essex, I have nothing to say in praise of him, and must refer all those who may wish to be acquainted with the particulars of his life to Mr. Sheridan's play of The Critic, where they will find many interesting anecdotes of him, as well as of his friend Sir Christopher Hatton. His Majesty was of that amiable disposition which inclines to friendship, and in such points was possessed of a keener penetration in discovering merit than many other people. I once heard an excellent charade on a carpet, of which the subject I am now on reminds me, and as I think it may afford my readers some amusement to find it out, I shall here take the liberty of presenting it to them. Charade. My first is what my second was to King James I, and you tread upon my whole. The principal favourites of his Majesty were Carr, who was afterwards created Earl of Somerset, and whose name perhaps may have some share in the above-mentioned charade, and George Villiers, afterward Duke of Buckingham. On his Majesty's death he was succeeded by his son Charles. Charles I. This amiable monarch seems born to have suffered misfortunes equal to those of his lovely grandmother, misfortunes which he could not deserve, since he was her descendant. Never certainly were there before so many detestable characters at one time in England as in this period of its history. Never were amiable men so scarce, the number of them throughout the whole kingdom accounting to only 5, besides the inhabitants of Oxford, who were always loyal to their king and faithful to his interests. The names of this noble 5, who never forgot the duty of the subject, or swerved from their attachment to his Majesty, were as follows: the King himself, ever steadfast in his own support, Archbishop Laud, Earl of Stratford, Viscount Falkland, and Duke of Ormond, who were scarcely less strenuous or zealous in the cause. While the villains of this time would make too long a list to be written or read, I shall therefore content myself with mentioning the leaders of the gang. Cromwell, Fairfax, Hampden, and Pym may be considered as the original causers of distresses and civil wars in which England for many years was embroiled. In this reign, as well as in that of Elizabeth, I am obliged, in spite of my attachment to the Scotch, to consider them as equally guilty with the generality of the English, since they dared to think differently from their sovereign, to forget the adoration which as stewards it was their duty to pay them, to rebel against, dethrone, and imprison the unfortunate Mary, to oppose, to deceive, and to sell the no less unfortunate Charles. The events of this monarch's reign are too numerous for my pen, and indeed the recital of any events, except what I make myself, is uninteresting to me. My principal reason for undertaking the history of England being to prove the innocence of the Queen of Scotland, which I flatter myself with having effectually done, and to abuse Elizabeth, though I am rather fearful of having fallen short in the latter part of my scheme. as therefore it is not my intention to give any particular account of the distresses into which this king was involved, through the misconduct and cruelty of his parliament. I shall satisfy myself with vindicating him from the reproach of arbitrary and tyrannical government, with which he has often been charged. This, I feel, is not difficult to be done, for with one argument I am certain of satisfying every sensible and well-disposed person whose opinions have been properly guided by a good education, and this argument is that he was a Stuart. Finis, Saturday, November 26th, 1791. End of recording. This recording is in the public domain.
Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. From the oval-shaped flower bed, there rose perhaps 100 stalks, spreading into heart-shaped or tongue-shaped leaves halfway up, and unfurling at the tip red or blue or yellow petals, marked with spots of color raised upon the surface. And from the red, blue, or yellow gloom of the throat emerged a straight bar, rough with gold dust and slightly clubbed at the end. The petals were voluminous enough to be stirred by the summer breeze, and when they moved, the red, blue, and yellow lights passed one over the other, staining an inch of the brown earth beneath with a spot of the most intricate color. The light fell either upon the smooth grey back of a pebble, or the shell of a snail with its brown circular veins, or falling into a raindrop, it expanded with such intensity of red, blue, and yellow the thin walls of water that one expected them to burst and disappear. Instead, the drop was left in a second silver grey once more, and the light now settled upon the flesh of a leaf, revealing the branching thread of fibre beneath the surface, and again it moved on and spread its illumination in the vast green spaces beneath the dome of the heart-shaped and tongue-shaped leaves. Then the breeze stirred rather more briskly overhead, and the color was flashed into the air above, into the eyes of the men and women who walk in Kew Gardens in July. The figures of these men and women straggled past the flower-bed with a curiously irregular movement, not unlike that of the white and blue butterflies who crossed the turf in zigzag flights from bed to bed. The man was about 6 inches in front of the woman, strolling carelessly, while she bore on with greater purpose, only turning her head now and then to see that the children were not too far behind. The man kept this distance in front of the woman purposely, though perhaps unconsciously, for he wished to go on with his thoughts. 15 years ago I came here with Lily, he thought. We sat somewhere over there by a lake, and I begged her to marry me all through the hot afternoon. How the dragonfly kept circling round us. How clearly I see the dragonfly, and her shoe with the square silver buckle at the toe. All the time I spoke I saw her shoe, and when it moved impatiently I knew without looking up what she was going to say. The whole of her seemed to be in her shoe. And my love, my desire, were in the dragonfly. For some reason I thought that if it settled there on that leaf, the broad one with the red flower in the middle of it, if the dragonfly settled on the leaf she would say yes at once. But the dragonfly went round and round. It never settled anywhere. Of course not, happily not, or I shouldn't be walking here with Eleanor and the children. Tell me, Eleanor, do you ever think of the past? Why do you ask, Simon? Because I've been thinking of the past. I've been thinking of Lily, the woman I might have married. Well, why are you silent? Do you mind my talking of the past? Why should I mind, Simon? Doesn't one always think of the past, in a garden with men and women lying under the trees? Aren't they one's past, all that remains of it, those men and women, those ghosts lying under the trees? One's happiness, one's reality? For me, a square silver shoe-buckle, and a dragonfly. For me, a kiss. Imagine 6 little girls sitting before their easels 20 years ago, down by the side of a lake painting the water lilies, the first red water lilies I'd ever seen. And suddenly, a kiss, there on the back of my neck. And my hand shook all the afternoon so that I couldn't paint. I took out my watch and marked the hour when I would allow myself to think of the kiss for 5 minutes only. It was so precious. The kiss of an old gray-haired woman with a wart on her nose, the mother of all my kisses all my life. "Come, Caroline. Come, Hubert." They walked on past the flower-bed, now walking 4 abreast, and soon diminished in size among the trees and looked half transparent as the sunlight and shade swam over their backs in large, trembling, irregular patches. In the oval flower-bed, the snail, whose shell had been stained red, blue, and yellow for the space of 2 minutes or so, now appeared to be moving very slightly in its shell, and next began to labor over the crumbs of loose earth which broke away and rolled down as it passed over them. It appeared to have a definite goal in front of it, differing in this respect from the singular, high-stepping, angular green insect who attempted to cross in front of it, and waited for a second with its antennae trembling as if in deliberation, and then stepped off as rapidly and strangely in the opposite direction. Brown cliffs with deep green lakes in the hollows, flat blade-like trees that waved from root to tip, round boulders of grey stone, vast crumpled surfaces of a thin crackling texture, all these objects lay across the snail's progress between one stalk and another to its goal. Before he had decided whether to circumvent the arched tent of a dead leaf, or to breast it, there came past the bed the feet of other human beings. This time they were both men. The younger of the 2 wore an expression of perhaps unnatural calm. He raised his eyes and fixed them very steadily in front of him while his companion spoke, and directly his companion had done speaking he looked on the ground again and sometimes opened his lips only after a long pause, and sometimes did not open them at all. The elder man had a curiously uneven and shaky method of walking, jerking his hand forward and throwing up his head abruptly, rather in the manner of an impatient carriage-horse tired of waiting outside a house. But in the man those gestures were irresolute and pointless. He talked almost incessantly. He smiled to himself and again began to talk, as if the smile had been an answer. He was talking about spirits, the spirits of the dead, who, according to him, were even now telling him all sorts of odd things about their experiences in heaven. "Heaven was known to the ancients as Thessaly, William, and now, with this war, the spirit matter is rolling between the hills like thunder." He paused, seemed to listen, smiled, jerked his head, and continued. "You have a small electric battery and a piece of rubber to insulate the wire. Isolate? Insulate? Well, we'll skip the details, no good going into details that wouldn't be understood. And in short, the little machine stands in any convenient position by the head of the bed, we will say, on a neat mahogany stand. All arrangements being properly fixed by workmen under my direction, the widow applies her ear and summons the spirit by sign as agreed. Women. Widows. Women in black." Here he seemed to have caught sight of a woman's dress in the distance, which in the shade looked a purple-black. He took off his hat, placed his hand upon his heart, and hurried towards her, muttering and gesticulating feverishly. But William caught him by the sleeve and touched a flower with the tip of his walking-stick in order to divert the old man's attention. After looking at it for a moment in some confusion, the old man bent his ear to it and seemed to answer a voice speaking from it, for he began talking about the forests of Uruguay, which he had visited hundreds of years ago in company with the most beautiful young woman in Europe. He could be heard murmuring about forests of Uruguay blanketed with the wax petals of tropical roses, nightingales, sea-beaches, mermaids, and women drowned at sea, as he suffered himself to be moved on by William, upon whose face the look of stoical patience grew slowly deeper and deeper. Following his steps so closely as to be slightly puzzled by his gestures, came two elderly women of the lower middle class, one stout and ponderous, the other rosy-cheeked and nimble. Like most people of their station, they were frankly fascinated by any signs of eccentricity betokening a disordered brain, especially in the well-to-do. But they were too far off to be certain whether the jesters were merely eccentric or genuinely mad. After they had scrutinized the old man's back in silence for a moment and given each other a queer, sly look, they went on energetically piecing together their very complicated dialogue. Nell, Bert, Lot, Cess, Phil, Pa, he says, I says, she says, I says, I says, I says, my Bert, Sis, Bill, Grandad, the old man, sugar, sugar, flowers, kippers, greens, sugar, sugar, sugar. The ponderous woman looked through the pattern of falling leaves at the flowers standing cool, firm and upright in the earth with a curious expression. She saw them as a sleeper waking from a heavy sleep sees a brass candlestick reflecting the light in an unfamiliar way, and closes his eyes and opens them, and seeing the brass candlestick again, finally starts broad awake and stares at the candlestick with all his powers. So the heavy woman came to a standstill opposite the oval-shaped flower-bed, and ceased even to pretend to listen to what the other woman was saying. She stood there letting the words fall over her, swaying the top part of her body slowly backwards and forwards, looking at the flowers. Then she suggested that they should find a seat and have their tea. The snail had now considered every possible method of reaching his goal without going round the dead leaf or climbing over it. Let alone the effort needed for climbing a leaf, he was doubtful whether the thin texture which vibrated with such an alarming crackle when touched, even by the tip of his horns, would bear his weight, and this determined him finally to creep beneath it, for there was a point where the leaf curved high enough from the ground to admit him. He had just inserted his head in the opening, and was taking stock of the high brown roof and was getting used to the cool brown light, when two other people came past outside on the turf. This time they were both young, a young man and a young woman. They were both in the prime of youth, or even in that season which precedes the prime of youth, the season before the smooth pink folds of the flower have burst their gummy case, when the wings of the butterfly, though fully grown, are motionless in the sun. "Lucky it isn't Friday," he observed. "Why? Do you believe in luck?" "They make you pay sixpence on Friday." "What's sixpence, anyway? Isn't it worth sixpence?" "What's it? What do you mean by it?" "Oh, anything. I mean, you know what I mean." Long pauses came between each of these remarks. They were uttered in toneless and monotonous voices. The couple stood still on the edge of the flower-bed, and together pressed the end of her parasol deep down into the soft earth. The action, and the fact that his hand rested on the top of hers, expressed their feelings in a strange way, as these short, insignificant words also expressed something, words with short wings for their heavy body of meaning, inadequate to carry them far and thus alighting awkwardly upon the very common objects that surrounded them, and were to their inexperienced touch so massive. But who knows, so they thought as they pressed the parasol into the earth, what precipices aren't concealed in them, or what slopes of ice don't shine in the sun on the other side? Who knows? Who has ever seen this before? Even when she wondered what sort of tea they gave you at Kew, he felt that something loomed up behind her words, and stood vast and solid behind them, and the mist very slowly rose and uncovered, oh heavens, what were those shapes? Little white tables, and waitresses who looked first at her and then at him, and there was a bill that he would pay with a real 2-shilling piece, and it was real, all real, he assured himself, fingering the coin in his pocket, real to everyone except to him and to her. Even to him it began to seem real. And then, but it was too exciting to stand and think any longer, and he pulled the parasol out of the earth with a jerk and was impatient to find the place where one had tea with other people, like other people. "Come along, Trissy. It's time we had our tea." "Wherever does one have one's tea?" she asked, with the oddest thrill of excitement in her voice, looking vaguely round and letting herself be drawn on down the grass path, trailing her parasol, turning her head this way and that way, forgetting her tea, wishing to go down there and then down there, remembering orchids and cranes among wild flowers, a Chinese pagoda, and a crimson-crested bird. But he bore her on. Thus one couple after another with much the same irregular and aimless movement passed the flower-bed, and were enveloped in layer after layer of green-blue vapour, in which at first their bodies had substance and a dash of colour, but later both substance and colour dissolved in the green-blue atmosphere. How hot it was! So hot that even the thrush chose to hop, like a mechanical bird, in the shadow of the flowers, with long pauses between one movement and the next. Instead of rambling vaguely, the white butterflies danced one above another, making with their white shifting flakes the outline of a shattered marble column. Above the tallest flowers, the glass roofs of the palm-house shone as if a whole market full of shiny green umbrellas had opened in the sun. And in the drone of the aeroplane, the voice of the summer sky murmured its fierce soul. Yellow and black, pink and snow-white, shapes of all these colours, men, women, and children were spotted for a second upon the horizon, and then, seeing the breadth of yellow that lay upon the grass, they wavered and sought shade beneath the trees, dissolving like drops of water in the yellow and green atmosphere, staining it faintly with red and blue. It seemed as if all gross and heavy bodies had sunk down in the heat, motionless, and lay huddled upon the ground, but their voices went wavering from them as if they were flames lolling from the thick waxen bodies of candles. Voices. Yes, voices. Wordless voices breaking the silence suddenly with such depth of contentment, such passion of desire, or, in the voices of children, such freshness of surprise, breaking the silence? But there was no silence. All the time the motor omnibuses were turning their wheels and changing their gear. Like a vast nest of Chinese boxes, all of wrought steel, turning ceaselessly one within another, the city murmured, on the top of which the voices cried aloud, and the petals of myriad flowers flashed their colours into the air. End of Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf. The Mark on the Wall by Virginia Woolf. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Perhaps it was the middle of January in the present that I first looked up and saw the mark on the wall. In order to fix a date, it is necessary to remember what one saw. So now I think of the fire, the steady film of yellow light upon the page of my book, the 3 chrysanthemums in the round glass bowl on the mantelpiece. Yes, it must have been the winter time, and we had just finished our tea, for I remember that I was smoking a cigarette when I looked up and saw the mark on the wall for the first time. I looked up through the smoke of my cigarette, and my eye lodged for a moment upon the burning coals, and that old fancy of the crimson flag flapping from the castle tower came into my mind, and I thought of the cavalcade of red knights riding up the side of the black rock. Rather to my relief, the sight of the mark interrupted the fancy, for it is an old fancy, an automatic fancy, made as a child perhaps. The mark was a small round mark, black upon the white wall, about 6 or 7 inches above the mantelpiece. How readily our thoughts swarm upon a new object, lifting it a little way, as ants carry a blade of straw so feverishly, and then leave it. If that mark was made by a nail, it can't have been for a picture. It must have been for a miniature. The miniature of a lady with white powdered curls, powder-dusted cheeks, and lips like red carnations. A fraud, of course, for the people who had this house before us would have chosen pictures in that way, an old picture for an old room. That is the sort of people they were. Very interesting people, and I think of them so often, in such queer places, because one will never see them again, never know what happened next. They wanted to leave this house because they wanted to change their style of furniture, so he said, and he was in process of saying that in his opinion art should have ideas behind it, when we were torn asunder, as one is torn from the old lady about to pour out tea, and the young man about to hit the tennis ball in the back garden of the suburban villa, as one rushes past in the train. But as for that mark, I'm not sure about it. I don't believe it was made by a nail after all. It's too big, too round for that. I might get up. But if I got up and looked at it, 10 to 1 I shouldn't be able to say for certain, because once a thing's done, no one ever knows how it happened. Oh, dear me, the mystery of life, the inaccuracy of thought, the ignorance of humanity. To show how very little control of our possessions we have, what an accidental affair this living is after all our civilization. Let me just count over a few of the things lost in one lifetime, beginning, for that seems always the most mysterious of losses, what cat would gnaw, what rat would nibble, 3 pale blue canisters of bookbinding tools. Then there were the bird cages, the iron hoops, the steel skates, the Queen Anne coal scuttle, the bagatelle board, the hand organ, all gone. And jewels, too. Opals and emeralds. They lie about the roots of turnips. What a scraping, paring affair it is, to be sure. The wonder is that I've any clothes on my back, that I sit surrounded by solid furniture at this moment. Why, if one wants to compare life to anything, one must liken it to being blown through the tube at 50 miles an hour, landing at the other end without a single hairpin in one's hair, shot out at the feet of God entirely naked, tumbling head over heels in the asphodel meadows like brown paper parcels pitched down a chute in the post office, with one's hair flying back like the tail of a racehorse. Yes, that seems to express the rapidity of life, the perpetual waste and repair, all so casual, all so haphazard. But after life, the slow pulling down of thick green stalks, so that the cup of the flower, as it turns over, deluges one with purple and red light. Why, after all, should one not be born there as one is born here, helpless, speechless, unable to focus one's eyesight, groping at the roots of the grass, at the toes of the giants? As for saying which are trees, and which are men and women, or whether there are such things, that one won't be in a condition to do for 50 years or so. There will be nothing but spaces of light and dark, intersected by thick stalks, and rather higher up, perhaps, rose-shaped blots of an indistinct color, dim pinks and blues, which will, as time goes on, become more definite, become I don't know what. And yet that mark on the wall is not a hole at all. It may even be caused by some round black substance, such as a small rose-leaf left over from the summer, and I, not being a very vigilant housekeeper, look at the dust on the mantelpiece, for example, the dust which, so they say, buried Troy 3 times over, only fragments of pots utterly refusing annihilation, as one can believe. The tree outside the window taps very gently on the pane. I want to think quietly, calmly, spaciously, never to be interrupted, never to have to rise from my chair, to slip easily from one thing to another, without any sense of hostility or obstacle. I want to sink deeper and deeper, away from the surface with its hard, separate facts. To steady myself, let me catch hold of the first idea that passes. Shakespeare. Well, he will do as well as another. A man who sat himself solidly in an armchair and looked into the fire, so. A shower of ideas fell perpetually from some very high heaven down through his mind. He leant his forehead on his hand, and people looking in through the open door, for this scene is supposed to take place on a summer's evening. Oh, but how dull this is, this historical fiction! It doesn't interest me at all. I wish I could hit upon a pleasant track of thought, a track indirectly reflecting credit upon myself, for those are the pleasantest thoughts, and very frequent even in the minds of modest mouse-colored people, who believe genuinely that they dislike to hear their own praises. They are not thoughts directly praising oneself. That is the beauty of them. They are thoughts like this. And then I came into the room. They were discussing botany. I said how I'd seen a flower growing on a dust heap on the site of an old house in Kingsway. The seed, I said, must have been sown in the reign of Charles I. What flowers grew in the reign of Charles I? I asked, but I don't remember the answer. Tall flowers with purple tassels to them, perhaps. And so it goes on. All the time I'm dressing up the figure of myself in my own mind, lovingly, stealthily, not openly adoring it, for if I did that I should catch myself out, and stretch my hand at once for a book in self-protection. Indeed, it is curious how instinctively one protects the image of oneself from idolatry, or any other handling that could make it ridiculous, or too unlike the original to be believed in any longer. Or is it not so very curious, after all? It is a matter of great importance. Suppose the looking-glass smashes, the image disappears, and the romantic figure with the green of forest depths all about it is there no longer, but only that shell of a person which is seen by other people. What an airless, shallow, bald, prominent world it becomes, a world not to be lived in. As we face each other in omnibuses and underground railways, we are looking into the mirror that accounts for the vagueness, the gleam of glassiness in our eyes. And the novelists in future will realize more and more the importance of these reflections, for of course there is not one reflection, but an almost infinite number. Those are the depths they will explore, those the phantoms they will pursue, leaving the description of reality more and more out of their stories, taking a knowledge of it for granted, as the Greeks did, and Shakespeare perhaps. But these generalizations are very worthless. The military sound of the word is enough. It recalls leading articles, cabinet ministers, a whole class of things indeed which as a child one thought the thing itself, the standard thing, the real thing, from which one could not depart save at the risk of nameless damnation. Generalizations bring back somehow Sunday in London, Sunday afternoon walks, Sunday luncheons, and also ways of speaking of the dead, clothes and habits, like the habit of sitting all together in one room until a certain hour, although nobody liked it. There was a rule for everything. The rule for tablecloths at that particular period was that they should be made of tapestry, with little yellow compartments marked upon them, such as you may see in photographs of the carpets in the corridors of the royal palaces. Tablecloths of a different kind were not real tablecloths. How shocking, and yet how wonderful it was to discover that these real things, Sunday luncheons, Sunday walks, country houses, and tablecloths, were not entirely real, were indeed half phantoms, and the damnation which visited the disbeliever in them was only a sense of illegitimate freedom. What now takes the place of those things, I wonder, those real standard things? Men, perhaps, should you be a woman. The masculine point of view which governs our lives, which sets the standard, which establishes Whitaker's table of precedency, which has become, I suppose, since the war, half a phantom to many men and women, which soon, one may hope, will be laughed into the dust-bin where the phantoms go. The mahogany sideboards and the Landseer prints, gods and devils, hell, and so forth, leaving us all with an intoxicating sense of illegitimate freedom. If freedom exists. In certain lights that mark on the wall seems actually to project from the wall. Nor is it entirely circular. I cannot be sure, but it seems to cast a perceptible shadow, suggesting that if I ran my finger down that strip of the wall, it would, at a certain point, mount and descend a small tumulus, a smooth tumulus like those barrows on the South Downs, which are, they say, either tombs or camps. Of the two, I should prefer them to be tombs, desiring melancholy like most English people, and finding it natural at the end of a walk to think of the bones stretched beneath the turf. There must be some book about it. Some antiquary must have dug up those bones and given them a name. What sort of a man is an antiquary, I wonder? Retired colonels, for the most part, I dare say, leading parties of aged labourers to the top here, examining clods of earth and stone and getting into correspondence with the neighbouring clergy, which, being opened at breakfast-time, gives them a feeling of importance. And the comparison of arrowheads necessitates cross-country journeys to the county towns, an agreeable necessity both to them and to their elderly wives, who wish to make plum jam or to clean out the study, and have every reason for keeping that great question of the camp or the tomb in perpetual suspension, while the colonel himself feels agreeably philosophic in accumulating evidence on both sides of the question. It is true that he does finally incline to believe in the camp, and being opposed, indites a pamphlet which he is about to read at the quarterly meeting of the local society, when a stroke lays him low, and his last conscious thoughts are not of wife or child, but of the camp and that arrowhead there, which is now in the case at the local museum, together with the foot of a Chinese murderess, a handful of Elizabethan nails, a great many Tudor clay pipes, a piece of Roman pottery, and the wine-glass that Nelson drank out of, proving I really don't know what. No, nothing is proved, nothing is known. And if I were to get up at this very moment and ascertain that the mark on the wall is really, what shall we say, the head of a gigantic old nail, driven in 200 years ago, which has now, owing to the patient attrition of many generations of housemaids, revealed its head above the coat of paint, and is taking its first view of modern life in the sight of a white-walled, firelit room, what should I gain? Knowledge? Matter for further speculation? I can think sitting still as well as standing up. And what is knowledge? What are our learned men save the descendants of witches and hermits, who crouched in caves and in woods brewing herbs, interrogating shrew mice and writing down the language of the stars? And the less we honour them as our superstitions dwindle and our respect for beauty and health of mind increases. Yes, one could imagine a very pleasant world, a quiet, spacious world, with the flowers so red and blue in the open fields. A world without professors, or specialists, or housekeepers with the profiles of policemen, a world which one could slice with one's thoughts as a fish slices the water with his fin, grazing the stems of the water lilies, hanging suspended over nests of white sea eggs. How peaceful it is, down here, rooted in the centre of the world and gazing up through the grey waters, with their sudden gleams of light and their reflections. If it were not for Whitaker's Almanac, if it were not for the table of precedency. I must jump up and see for myself what that mark on the wall really is. A nail? A rose-leaf, a crack in the wood? Here is nature once more at her old game of self-preservation. This train of thought, she perceives, is threatening mere waste of energy, even some collision with reality, for who will ever be able to lift a finger against Whitaker's table of precedency? The Archbishop of Canterbury is followed by the Lord High Chancellor. The Lord High Chancellor is followed by the Archbishop of York. Everybody follows somebody. Such is the philosophy of Whitaker, and the great thing is to know who follows whom. Whitaker knows, and let that, so nature counsels, comfort you instead of enraging you. And if you can't be comforted, if you must shatter this hour of peace, think of the mark on the wall. I understand nature's game, her prompting to take action as a way of ending any thought that threatens to excite or to pain. Hence, I suppose, comes our slight contempt for men of action, men, we assume, who don't think. Still, there's no harm in putting a full stop to one's disagreeable thoughts by looking at a mark on the wall. Indeed, now that I have fixed my eyes upon it, I feel that I have grasped a plank in the sea. I feel a satisfying sense of reality, which at once turns the two archbishops and the Lord High Chancellor to the shadows of shades. Here is something definite, something real. Thus, waking from a midnight dream of horror, one hastily turns on the light and lies quiescent, worshipping the chest of drawers, worshipping solidity, worshipping reality, worshipping the impersonal world which is a proof of some existence other than ours. That is what one wants to be sure of. Wood is a pleasant thing to think about. It comes from a tree, and trees grow, and we don't know how they grow. For years and years they grow, without paying any attention to us, in meadows, in forests, and by the side of rivers, all things one likes to think about. The cows swish their tails beneath them on hot afternoons. They paint rivers so green that when a moorhen dives, one expects to see its feathers all green when it comes up again. I like to think of the fish balanced against the stream like flags blown out, and of water beetles slowly raiding domes of mud upon the bend of the river. I like to think of the tree itself, first the close, dry sensation of being wood, then the grinding of the storm, then the slow, delicious ooze of sap. I like to think of it, too, on winter's nights, standing in the empty field with all leaves close furled, nothing tender exposed to the iron bullets of the moon, a naked mast upon an earth that goes tumbling, tumbling all night long. The song of birds must sound very loud and strange in June, and how cold the feet of insects must feel upon it, as they make laborious progresses up the creases of the bark, or sun themselves upon the thin green awning of the leaves, and look straight in front of them with diamond-cut red eyes. One by one, the fibres snap beneath the immense cold pressure of the earth. Then the last storm comes, and falling, the highest branches drive deep into the ground again. Even so, life isn't done with. There are a million patient, watchful lives still for a tree. All over the world, in bedrooms, in ships, on the pavement, lining rooms where men and women sit after tea smoking cigarettes. It is full of peaceful thoughts, happy thoughts, this tree. I should like to take each one separately, but something is getting in the way. Where was I? What has it all been about? A tree? A river? The downs? Whitaker's almanac? The fields of asphodel? I can't remember a thing. Everything's moving, falling, slipping, vanishing. There is a vast upheaval of matter. Someone is standing over me and saying, "I'm going out to buy a newspaper." Yes? Though it's no good buying newspapers. Nothing ever happens. Curse this war. God damn this war! All the same, I don't see why we should have a snail on our wall. Oh, the mark on the wall. It was a snail. End of The Mark on the Wall by Virginia Woolf.
For the Instruction of the Overeducated by Oscar Wilde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tim Bulkeley of BigBible.org. A few maxims for the instruction of the overeducated. First published anonymously in the 1894 November the 17th issue of Saturday Review. Education is an admirable thing, but it is well to remember from time to time that nothing that is worth knowing can be taught. Public opinion exists only where there are no ideas. The English are always degrading truths into facts. When a truth becomes a fact, it loses all its intellectual value. It is a very sad thing that nowadays there is so little useless information. The only link between literature and drama left to us in England at the present moment is the bill of the play. In the old days, books were written by men of letters and read by the public. Nowadays, books are written by the public and read by nobody. Most women are so artificial they have no sense of art. Most men are so natural they have no sense of beauty. Friendship is far more tragic than love. It lasts longer. What is abnormal in life stands in normal relations to art. It is the only thing in life that stands in normal relations to art. A subject that is beautiful in itself gives no suggestion to the artist. It lacks imperfection. The only thing that the artist cannot see is the obvious. The only thing the public can see is the obvious. The result is the criticism of the journalist. Art is the only serious thing in the world, and the artist is the only person who is never serious. To be really medieval, one should have no body. To be really modern, one should have no soul. To be really Greek, one should have no clothes. Dandyism is the assertion of the absolute modernity of beauty. The only thing that can console one for being poor is extravagance. The only thing that can console one for being rich is economy. One should never listen. To listen is a sign of indifference to one's hearers. Even the disciple has his uses. He stands behind one's throne, and at the moment of one's triumph, whispers in one's ear that, after all, one is immortal. The criminal classes are so close to us that even the policeman can see them. They are so far away from us that only the poet can understand them. Those whom the gods love grow young. End of A Few Maxims for the Instruction of the Overeducated by Oscar Wilde. Read by Tim Bulkeley of BigBible.org.
Ningyo no Haka by Lafcadio Hearn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ningyo no Haka from Gleanings in Buddha Fields by Lafcadio Hearn. Manyamon had coaxed the child indoors and made her eat. She appeared to be about 11 years old, intelligent and pathetically docile. Her name was Ine, which means springing rice, and her frail slimness made the name seem appropriate. When she began, under Manyemon's gentle persuasion, to tell her story, I anticipated something queer from the accompanying change in her voice. She spoke in a high, thin, sweet tone, perfectly even, a tone changeless and unemotional as the chanting of the little kettle over its charcoal bed. Not unfrequently in Japan one may hear a girl or a woman utter something touching or cruel or terrible in just such a steady, level, penetrating tone, but never anything indifferent. It always means that feeling is being kept under control. "There were 6 of us at home," said Ine, "mother and father's mother, who was very old, and my brother and myself, and a little sister. Father was a hyoguya, a paper hanger. He papered sliding screens and also mounted kakemono. Mother was a hairdresser. My brother was apprenticed to a seal cutter. Father and mother did well. Mother made even more money than father. We had good clothes and good food, and we never had any real sorrow until father fell sick. It was the middle of the hot season. Father had always been healthy. We did not think that his sickness was dangerous, and he did not think so himself, but the very next day he died. We were very much surprised. Mother tried to hide her heart, and to wait upon her customers as before, but she was not very strong, and the pain of father's death came too quickly. 8 days after father's funeral, mother died also. It was so sudden that everybody wondered. Then the neighbours told us that we must make a Ningyo no Haka at once, or else there would be another death in our house. My brother said they were right, but he put off doing what they told him. Perhaps he did not have money enough, I do not know, but the Haka was not made." "What is a Ningyo no Haka?" I interrupted. "I think," Manyemon made answer, "that you have seen many Ningyo no Haka without knowing what they were. They look just like graves of children. It is believed that when 2 of a family die in the same year, a third also must soon die. There is a saying, 'always 3 graves.' So when 2 out of one family have been buried in the same year, a third grave is made next to the graves of those 2, and in it is put a coffin containing only a little figure of straw, wara ningyo, and over that grave a small tombstone is set up, bearing a kaimyo. The priests of the temple to which the graveyard belongs write the kaimyo for these little gravestones. By making a Ningyo no Haka, it is thought that a death may be prevented. We listen for the rest, Ine." The child resumed. "There were still 4 of us, grandmother, brother, myself, and my little sister. My brother was 19 years old. He had finished his apprenticeship just before father died. We thought that was like the pity of the gods for us. He had become the head of the house. He was very skillful in his business and had many friends. Therefore he could maintain us. He had made 13 yen the first month. That is very good for a seal cutter. One evening he came home sick. He said that his head hurt him. Mother had then been dead 47 days. That evening he could not eat. Next morning he was not able to get up. He had a very hot fever. We nursed him as well as we could, and sat up at night to watch by him, but he did not get better. On the morning of the 3rd day of his sickness we became frightened, because he began to talk to mother. It was the 49th day after mother's death, the day the soul leaves the house, and brother spoke as if mother was calling him. 'Yes, mother, yes, in a little while I shall come.' Then he told us that mother was pulling him by the sleeve. He would point with his hand and call to us, 'There she is, there, do you not see her?' We would tell him that we could not see anything. Then he would say, 'Ah, you did not look quick enough. She's hiding now. She has gone down under the floor mats.' All the morning he talked like that, At last grandmother stood up and stamped her foot on the floor and reproached mother, speaking very loud. "Taka," she said, "Taka, what you do is very wrong. When you were alive we all loved you. None of us ever spoke unkind words to you. Why do you now want to take the boy? You know that he is the only pillar of our house. You know that if you take him there will not be anyone to care for the ancestors. You know that if you take him you will destroy the family name. Oh, Taka, it is cruel, it is shameful, it is wicked." Grandmother was so angry that all her body trembled. Then she sat down and cried, and I and my little sister cried. But our brother said that mother was still pulling him by the sleeve. When the sun went down, he died. Grandmother wept and stroked us, and sang a little song that she made herself. I can remember it still. Oya no nai koto, hamabe no chidori, higure higure ni sode shiboru. So the third grave was made, but it was not a Ningyo no Haka, and that was the end of our house. We lived with kindred until winter, when grandmother died. She died in the night, when nobody knew. In the morning she seemed to be sleeping, but she was dead. Then I and my little sister were separated. My sister was adopted by a tatamiya, a mat maker, one of father's friends. She is kindly treated. She even goes to school. "Ah, fushigi na koto da. Ah, komatta ne," murmured Manyemon. Then there was a moment or two of sympathetic silence. Ine prostrated herself in thanks and rose to depart. As she slipped her feet onto the thongs of her sandals, I moved toward the spot where she'd been sitting, to ask the old man a question. She perceived my intention, and immediately made an indescribable sign to Manyemon, who responded by checking me just as I was going to sit down beside him. "She wishes," he said, "that the master will honourably strike the matting first." "But why?" I asked in surprise, noting only that under my unshod feet the spot where the child had been kneeling felt comfortably warm. Manyemon answered, "She believes that to sit down upon the place made warm by the body of another is to take into one's own life all the sorrow of that other person, unless the place be stricken first." Whereat I sat down without performing the rite, and we both laughed. "Ine," said Manyemon, "the master takes your sorrows upon him. He wants," I cannot venture to render Manyemon's honorifics, "to understand the pain of other people. You need not fear for him, Ine." End of Ningyo no Haka by Lafcadio Hearn. Read for LibriVox by David Barnes.
Peach Blossom Shangri-la by Tao Yuanming. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Sze, Hong Kong. During the Taiyuan era of the Jin dynasty, there was a man of Wulin who made his living as a fisherman. Once, while following a stream, he forgot how far he had gone. He suddenly came to a grove of blossoming peach trees. It lined both banks for several hundred paces, and included not a single other kind of tree. Petals of the dazzling and fragrant blossoms were falling everywhere in profusion. Thinking this place highly unusual, the fisherman advanced once again in wanting to see how far it went. The peach tree stopped at the stream's source, where the fisherman came to a mountain with a small opening through which it seemed he could see light. Leaving his boat, he entered the opening. At first it was so narrow that he could barely pass, but after advancing a short distance, it suddenly opened up to reveal a broad, flat area with imposing houses, good fields, beautiful ponds, mulberry trees, bamboo, and the like. The fisherman saw paths extending among the fields in all directions, and could hear the sounds of chickens and dogs. Men and women working in the fields all wore clothing that looked like that of foreign lands. The elderly and children all seemed to be happy and enjoying themselves. The people were amazed to see the fisherman, and they asked him from where he had come. He told them in detail. Then the people invited him to their home, set out wine, butchered a chicken, and prepared a meal. Other villagers heard about the fisherman, and they all came to ask him questions. Then the villagers told him, to avoid the chaos of war during the Qin dynasty, our ancestors brought their families and villages to this isolated place and never left it. So we've had no contact with the outside world. They asked the fishermen what the present reign was. They were not even aware of the Han dynasty, let alone the Wei and Jin. The fisherman told them everything he knew in great detail, and the villagers were amazed and heaved sighs. Then other villagers also invited the fisherman to their homes, where they gave him food and drink. After several days there, the fisherman bid farewell, at which time some villagers told him, "It's not worth telling people on the outside about us." The fisherman exited through the opening, found his boat, and retraced his route while leaving markers to find his place again. Upon his arrival at the prefecture town, he went to the prefect and told him what had happened. The prefect immediately sent a person to follow the fisherman and look for the trail markers, but he got lost and never found the way. Liu Ziji of Nanyang was a person of noble character. When he heard this story, he was happy and planned to visit the Shangri-la, but he died of illness before he could accomplish it. After that, no one else ever looked for the place. End of Peach Blossom Shangri-La by Tao Yuanming.
Story of the Faithful Cat by Algernon Bertram Freeman Mitford. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Clarica. About 60 years ago, in the summer-time, a man went to pay a visit at a certain house at Osaka, and, in the course of conversation, said, "I have eaten some very extraordinary cakes to-day," and on being asked what he meant, he told the following story. "I received the cakes from the relatives of a family who were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the death of a cat that had belonged to their ancestors. When I asked the history of the affair, I was told that, in former days, a young girl of the family, when she was about 16 years old, used always to be followed about by a tomcat, who was reared in the house, so much so that the two were never separated for an instant. When her father perceived this, he was very angry, thinking that the tomcat, forgetting the kindness with which he had been treated for years in the house, had fallen in love with his daughter, and intended to cast a spell upon her, so he determined that he must kill the beast. As he was planning this in secret, the cat overheard him, and that night went to his pillow, and, assuming a human voice, said to him, 'You suspect me of being in love with your daughter, and although you might well be justified in so thinking, your suspicions are groundless. The fact is this. There is a very large old rat who has been living for many years in your granary. Now it is this old rat who is in love with my young mistress, and this is why I dare not leave her side for a moment, for fear the old rat should carry her off. Therefore I pray you to dispel your suspicions. But as I, by myself, am no match for the rat, there is a famous cat, named Bucci, at the house of Mr. So-and-so at Ajikawa. If you will borrow that cat, we will soon make an end of the old rat." When the father awoke from his dream, he thought it so wonderful that he told the household of it, and the following day he got up very early and went off to Ajikawa, to inquire for the house which the cat had indicated, and had no difficulty in finding it. So he called upon the master of the house, and told him what his own cat had said, and how he wished to borrow the cat Bucci for a little while. "That's a very easy matter to settle," said the other. "Pray take him with you at once." And accordingly the father went home with the cat Bucci in charge. That night he put the two cats into the granary, and after a little while a frightful clatter was heard, and then all was still again. So the people of the house opened the door and crowded out to see what had happened. And there they beheld the two cats and the rat all locked together and panting for breath. So they cut the throat of the rat, which was as big as either of the cats. Then they attended to the two cats, but although they gave them ginseng and other restoratives, they both got weaker and weaker, until at last they died. So the rat was thrown into the river, but the two cats were buried with all honors in a neighboring temple. End of the story of the Faithful Cat, by Algernon Bertram Freeman Mitford. Trusty John, from the Blue Fairy Book, by Andrew Lang. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Clarica. Trusty John. Once upon a time there was an old king who was so ill that he thought to himself, "I am most likely on my death-bed." Then he said, "Send Trusty John to me." Now Trusty John was his favorite servant, and was so called because all his life he had served him so faithfully. When he approached the bed, the king spake to him. "Most trusty John, I feel my end is drawing near, and I could face it without a care were it not for my son. He is still too young to decide everything for himself, and unless you promise me to instruct him in all he should know, and to be to him as a father, I shall not close my eyes in peace." Then Trusty John answered, "I will never desert him, and will serve him faithfully, even though it should cost me my life." Then the old king said, "Now I die comforted and in peace." And then he went on, "After my death you must show him the whole castle, all the rooms and apartments and vaults, and all the treasures that lie in them. But you must not show him the last room in the long passage, where the picture of the Princess of the Golden Roof is hidden. When he beholds that picture he will fall violently in love with it, and go off into a dead faint, and for her sake he will encounter many dangers. You must guard him from this." And when Trusty John had again given the king his hand upon it, the old man became silent, laid his head on the pillow, and died. When the old king had been carried to his grave, Trusty John told the young king what he had promised his father on his death-bed, and added, "And I shall assuredly keep my word, and shall be faithful to you as I have been to him, even though it should cost me my life." Now when the time of mourning was over, Trusty John said to him, "It is time you should see your inheritance. I will show you your ancestral castle." So he took him over everything, and let him see all the riches and splendid apartments, only the one room where the picture was he did not open. But the picture was placed so that if the door opened you gazed straight upon it, and it was so beautifully painted that you imagined it lived and moved, and that it was the most lovable and beautiful thing in the whole world. But the young king noticed that Trusty John always missed the one door, and said, "Why do you never open this one for me?" "There is something inside that would appall you," he answered. But the king replied, "I have seen the whole castle, and shall find out what is in there." And with these words he approached the door and wanted to force it open. But Trusty John held him back, and said, "I promised your father before his death that you shouldn't see what that room contains. It might bring both you and me to great grief." "Ah, no," answered the young king. and if I don't get in it will be my certain destruction. I should have no peace night or day till I had seen what was in the room with my own eyes. Now I won't budge from the spot till you have opened the door." Then Trusty John saw there was no way out of it, so with a heavy heart and many sighs he took the key from the big bunch. When he had opened the door he stepped in first, and thought to cover the likeness so that the king might not perceive it. But it was hopeless. The king stood on tiptoe and looked over his shoulder. And when he saw the picture of the maid, so beautiful and glittering with gold and precious stones, he fell swooning to the ground. Trusty John lifted him up, carried him to bed, and thought sorrowfully, "The curse has come upon us, gracious heaven! What will be the end of it all?" Then he poured wine down his throat till he came to himself again. The first words he spoke were, "Oh, who is the original of that beautiful picture?" "She is the Princess of the Golden Roof," answered Trusty John. Then the king continued, "My love for her is so great that if all the leaves on the trees had tongues they could not express it. My very life depends on my winning her. You are my most trusty John, you must stand by me." The faithful servant pondered long how they were to set about the matter, for it was said to be difficult even to get into the presence of the princess. At last he hit upon a plan, and spoke to the king. "All the things she has about her, tables, chairs, dishes, goblets, bowls, and all her household furniture, are made of gold. You have in your treasure 5 tons of gold. Let the goldsmiths of your kingdom manufacture them into all manner of vases and vessels, into all sorts of bird and game and wonderful beasts. That will please her. We shall go to her with them and try our luck." The king summoned all his goldsmiths, and they had to work hard day and night, till at length the most magnificent things were completed. When a ship had been laden with them, the faithful John disguised himself as a merchant, and the king had to do the same, so that they should be quite unrecognizable. And so they crossed the seas and journeyed till they reached the town where the Princess of the Golden Roof dwelt. Trusty John made the king remain behind on the ship and await his return. "Perhaps I may bring the princess back with me, so see that everything is in order. Let the gold ornaments be arranged, and the whole ship decorated." Then he took a few of the gold things in his apron, went ashore, and proceeded straight to the palace. When he came to the courtyard he found a beautiful maiden standing at the well, drawing water with 2 golden pails. And as she was about to carry away the glittering water, she turned round and saw the stranger, and asked him who he was. Then he replied, "I am a merchant," and, opening his apron, he let her peep in. "Oh my!" she cried, "what beautiful gold wares!" She set down her pails and examined one thing after the other. Then she said, "The princess must see this. She has such a fancy for gold things that she will buy up all you have." She took him by the hand and led him into the palace, for she was the lady's maid. When the princess had seen the wares she was quite enchanted, and said, "They are all so beautifully made that I shall buy everything you have." But Trusty John said, "I am only the servant of a rich merchant. What I have here is nothing compared to what my master has on his ship. His merchandise is more artistic and costly than anything that has ever been made in gold before." She desired to have everything brought up to her, but he said, "There is such a quantity of things that it would take many days to bring them up, and they would take up so many rooms that you would have no space for them in your house." Thus her desire and curiosity were excited to such an extent that at last she said, "Take me to your ship. I shall go there myself and view your master's treasures." Then Trusty John was quite delighted, and brought her to the ship, and the king, when he beheld her, saw that she was even more beautiful than her picture, and thought every moment that his heart would burst. She stepped on to the ship, and the king led her inside. But Trusty John remained behind with the steersman, and ordered the ship to push off. "Spread all sail, that we may fly on the ocean like a bird in the air." Meanwhile the king showed the princess inside all his gold wares, every single bit of it, dishes, goblets, bowls, the birds and game, and all the wonderful beasts. Many hours passed thus, and she was so happy that she did not notice that the ship was sailing away. After she had seen the last thing, she thanked the merchant and prepared to go home. But when she came to the ship's side, she saw that they were on the high seas, far from land, and that the ship was speeding on its way under full canvas. "Oh!" she cried in terror, "I am deceived, carried away and betrayed into the power of a merchant. I would rather have died." But the king seized her hand and spake, I am no merchant, but a king of as high birth as yourself, and it was my great love for you that made me carry you off by stratagem. The first time I saw your likeness I fell to the ground in a swoon." When the Princess of the Golden Roof heard this she was comforted, and her heart went out to him, so that she willingly consented to become his wife. Now it happened one day, while they were sailing on the high seas, that Trusty John, sitting on the forepart of the ship, fiddling away to himself, observed 3 ravens in the air flying towards him. He ceased playing and listened to what they were saying, for he understood their language. The one croaked, "Aha! So he's bringing the Princess of the Golden Roof home." "Yes," answered the second, "but he's not got her yet." "Yes, he has," spake the third, "for she's sitting beside him on the ship." Then number 1 began again and cried, "That'll not help him. When they reach the land a chestnut horse will dash forward to greet them. The king will wish to mount it, and if he does it will gallop away with him and disappear into the air, and he will never see his bride again." "Is there no escape for him?" asked number 2. "Oh, yes. If someone else mounts quickly, and shoots the horse dead with a pistol that is sticking in the holster, then the young king is saved. But who's to do that? And anyone who knows it and tells him will be turned into stone from his feet to his knees." Then spake number 2, "I know more than that. Even if the horse is slain, the young king will still not keep his bride. When they enter the palace together, they will find a ready-made wedding shirt in a cupboard, which looks as though it were woven of gold and silver, but is really made of nothing but sulphur and tar. When the king puts it on, it will burn him to his marrow and bones." Number 3 asked, "Is there no way of escape, then?" "Oh, yes," answered number 2. "If someone seizes the shirt with gloved hands and throws it into the fire and lets it burn, then the young king is saved." "But what's the good? Anyone knowing this and telling it will have half his body turned into stone, from his knees to his heart." Then number 3 spake, "I know yet more. Though the bridal shirt too be burnt, the king hasn't even then secured his bride. When the dance is held after the wedding, and the young queen is dancing, she will suddenly grow deadly white, and drop down like one dead, and unless someone lifts her up, and draws 3 drops of blood from her right side, and spits them out again, she will die. But if anyone who knows this betrays it, he will be turned into stone from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet." When the ravens had thus conversed they fled onward, but Trusty John had taken it all in, and was sad and depressed from that time forward. For if he were silent to his master concerning what he had heard, he would involve him in misfortune; but if he took him into his confidence, then he himself would forfeit his life. At last he said, "I will stand by my master, though it should be my ruin." Now when they drew near the land, it came to pass just as the ravens had predicted, and a splendid chestnut horse bounded forward. "Capital," said the king. "This animal shall carry me to my palace," and was about to mount, but Trusty John was too sharp for him, and springing up quickly, seized the pistol out of the holster, and shot the horse dead. Then the other servants of the king, who at no time looked favorably on Trusty John, cried out, "What a sin to kill the beautiful beast that was to bear the king to his palace!" But the king spake, "Silence, let him alone. He is ever my most trusty John. Who knows for what good end he may have done this thing?" So they went on their way and entered the palace, and there in the hall stood a cupboard in which lay the ready-made bridal shirt, looking for all the world as though it were made of gold and silver. The young king went toward it, and was about to take hold of it, but Trusty John, pushing him aside, seized it with his gloved hands, threw it hastily into the fire, and let it burn. The other servants commenced grumbling again, and said, "See, he's actually burning the king's bridal shirt." But the young king spoke, "Who knows for what good purpose he does it? Let him alone, for he is my most trusty John." Then the wedding was celebrated, the dance began, and the bride joined in, but Trusty John watched her countenance carefully. Of a sudden she grew deadly white, and fell to the ground as if she were dead. He at once sprang hastily toward her, lifted her up, and bore her to a room, where he laid her down, and kneeling beside her, he drew 3 drops of blood from her right side, and spat them out. She soon breathed again and came to herself, but the young king had watched the proceeding, and not knowing why Trusty John had acted as he did, he flew into a passion, and cried, "Throw him into prison." On the following morning sentence was passed on Trusty John, and he was condemned to be hanged. As he stood on the gallows he said, "Everyone doomed to death has the right to speak once before he dies, and I, too, have that privilege?" "Yes," said the king, "it shall be granted to you." So Trusty John spoke. I am unjustly condemned, for I have always been faithful to you." And he proceeded to relate how he had heard the raven's conversation on the sea, and how he had to do all he did in order to save his master. Then the King cried, "Oh, my most trusty John, pardon, pardon, take him down." But as he uttered the last word, Trusty John had fallen lifeless to the ground, and was a stone. The King and Queen were in despair, and the King spake, "Ah, how ill I have rewarded such great fidelity!" and made them lift up the stone image and place it in his bedroom near his bed. As often as he looked at it, he wept and said, "Oh, if I could only restore you to life, my most trusty John!" After a time the Queen gave birth to twins, 2 small sons, who throve and grew, and were a constant joy to her. One day when the Queen was at church, and the 2 children sat and played with their father, he gazed again full of grief on the stone statue, and sighing, wailed, "Oh, if only I could restore you to life, my most trusty John!" Suddenly the stone began to speak, and said, "Yes, you can restore me to life again, if you are prepared to sacrifice what you hold most dear." And the King cried out, "All I have in the world will I give up for your sake." The stone continued, "If you cut off with your own hand the heads of your 2 children, and smear me with their blood, I shall come back to life." The King was aghast when he heard that he himself had to put his children to death, but when he thought of Trusty John's fidelity, and how he had even died for him, he drew his sword, and with his own hand cut the heads off his children. And Trusty John stood once more safe and sound before him. He spake to the King, "Your loyalty shall be rewarded." And taking up the heads of the children, he placed them on their bodies, smeared the wounds with their blood, and in a minute they were all right again, and jumping about as if nothing had happened. Then the King was full of joy, and when he saw the Queen coming, he hid Trusty John and the 2 children in a big cupboard. As she entered, he said to her, "Did you pray in church?" "Yes," she answered, "but my thoughts dwelt constantly on Trusty John, and of what he has suffered for us." Then he spake, "Dear wife, we can restore him to life, but the price asked is our 2 little sons. We must sacrifice them." The Queen grew white and her heart sank, but she replied, "We owe it to him on account of his great fidelity." Then he rejoiced that she was of the same mind as he had been, and going forward he opened the cupboard, and fetched the 2 children and Trusty John out, saying, "God be praised! Trusty John is free once more, and we have our 2 small sons again." Then he related to her all that had passed, and they lived together happily ever afterward. End of Trusty John from the Blue Fairy Book by Andrew Lang.
The Wrong Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. The Wrong Black Bag by Angelo Lewis. It was the eve of Good Friday. Within the modest parlour of number 13 Primrose Terrace, a little man, wearing a grey felt hat and a red necktie, stood admiring himself in the looking-glass over the mantelpiece. Such a state of things anywhere else would have had no significance whatever, but circumstances proverbially alter cases. At 13 Primrose Terrace it approached the dimensions of a portent. Not to keep the reader in suspense, the little man was Benjamin Quelch, clerk in the office of Messrs. Cobble and Clink, coal merchants, and he was about to carry out a desperate resolution. Most men have some secret ambition. Benjamin's was twofold. For years he had yearned to wear a soft felt hat and to make a trip to Paris, and for years fate, in the person of Mrs. Quelch, had stood in the way and prevented the indulgence of his longing. Quelch being, as we have hinted, exceptionally small of stature, had, in accordance with mysterious law of opposites, selected the largest lady of his acquaintance as the partner of his joys. He himself was of a meek and retiring disposition. Mrs. Quelch, on the other hand, was a woman of stern and decided temperament. with strong views upon most subjects. She administered Benjamin's finances, regulated his diet, and prescribed for him when his health was out of order. Though fond of him in her own way, she ruled him with a rod of iron, and on 3 points she was inflexible. To make up for his insignificance of stature, she insisted on his wearing the tallest hat that money could procure, to the exclusion of all other headgear. Secondly, on the ground that it looked more professional, she would allow him none but black silk neckties. And lastly, she would not let him smoke. She had further an intense repugnance to all things foreign, holding as an article of faith that no good thing, whether in art, cookery, or morals, was to be found on other than English soil. When Benjamin once, in a rash moment, suggested a trip to Boulogne by way of summer holiday, the suggestion was received in a manner that took away his appetite for a week afterward. The prohibition of smoking Quelch did not much mind, for, having in his salad days made trial of a cheap cigar, the result somehow satisfies him that tobacco was not in his line, and he ceased to yearn for it accordingly. But the tall hat and the black tie were constant sources of irritation. He had an idea, based on his having once won a drawing prize at school, that nature had intended him for an artist, and he secretly lamented the untoward fate which has thrown him away upon coals. Now the few artists Benjamin had chanced to meet affected a soft and slouchy style of headgear, and a considerable amount of freedom, generally with a touch of colour, in the region of the neck. Such, therefore, in the fitness of things, should have been the hat, and such the neckgear of Benjamin Quelch, and the veto of his wife only made him yearn for them the more intensely. In later years he had been seized with a longing to see Paris. It chanced that a clerk in the same office, one Peter Flip, had made one of a personally conducted party on a visit to the gay city. The cost of the trip had been but 5 guineas, but never, surely, were 5 guineas so magnificently invested. There was a good deal of romance about Flip, and it may be that his accounts were not entirely trustworthy, but they so fired the imagination of our friend Benjamin that he had at once begun to hoard up surreptitious sixpences, with the hope that some day he too might, by some unforeseen combination of circumstances, be enabled to visit the enchanted city. And at last that day had come. Mrs. Quelch, her 3 children, and her 1 domestic, had gone to Lowestoft for an Easter outing, Benjamin and a deaf charwoman, Mrs. Widger, being left in charge of the family belongings. Benjamin's Easter holidays were limited to Good Friday and Easter Monday, and, as it seemed hardly worth while that he should travel so far as Lowestoft for such short periods, Mrs. Quelch had thoughtfully arranged that he should spend the former day at the British Museum, and the latter at the Zoological Gardens. 2 days after her departure, however, Mr. Cobble called Quelch into his private office and told him that if he liked he might for once take holiday from Friday to Tuesday inclusive, and join his wife at the seaside. Quelch accepted the boon with an honest intention of employing it as suggested. Indeed, he had even begun a letter to his wife announcing the pleasing intelligence, and had got as far as "My dear Penelope," when a wild and wicked thought struck him. Why should he not spend his unexpected holiday in Paris? Laying down his pen, he opened his desk, and counted his secret hoard. It amounted to £5 12 shillings more than Flip's outlay. There was no difficulty in that direction, and nobody would be any the wiser. His wife would imagine that he was in London, while his employers would believe him to be at Lowestoft. There was a brief struggle in his mind, but the tempter prevailed, and, with a courage worthy of a better cause, he determined to risk it and go. And thus it came to pass that, on the evening of our story, Benjamin Quelch, having completed his packing, which merely comprised what he was accustomed to call his night things, neatly bestowed in a small black handbag belonging to Mrs. Quelch, stood before the looking-glass and contemplated his guilty splendour. The red necktie and the soft grey felt hat, purchased out of surplus funds. He had expended a couple of guineas in a second-class return ticket, and another £2 in coupons, entitling him to bed, breakfast, and dinner for 5 days at certain specified hotels in Paris. This outlay, with half a crown for a pair of gloves, and a bribe of 5 shillings to secure the silence of Mrs. Widger, left him with little more than £1 in hand, but this small surplus would no doubt amply suffice for his modest needs. His only regret, as he gazed at himself in the glass, was that he had not had time to grow a moustache, the one thing needed to complete his artistic appearance. But time was fleeting, and he dared not linger over the enticing picture. He stole along the passage, and softly opened the street door. As he did so a sudden panic came over him, and he felt half inclined to abandon his rash design. But as he wavered, he caught a sight of the detested tall hat hanging up in the passage, and he hesitated no longer. He passed out, and, closing the door behind him, started at a brisk pace for Victoria Station. His plans had been laid with much ingenuity, though at a terrible sacrifice of his usual straightforwardness. He had written a couple of letters to Mrs. Quelch, to be posted by Mrs. Widger on appropriate days, giving imaginary accounts of his visits to the British Museum and Zoological Gardens, with pointed allusions to the behaviour of the elephant, and other circumstantial particulars. To ensure the posting of these in proper order, he had marked the dates in pencil on the envelopes in the corner usually occupied by the postage stamp, so that when the latter was affixed, the figures would be concealed. He explained the arrangement to Mrs. Widger, who promised that his instructions should be faithfully carried out. After a sharp walk he reached the railway station, and in due course found himself steaming across the Channel to Dieppe. The passage was not especially rough, but to poor Quelch, unaccustomed as he was to the sea, it seemed as if the boat must go to the bottom every moment. To the bodily pains of sea-sickness were added the mental pains of remorse, and between the two he reached Dieppe more dead than alive. Indeed, he would almost have welcomed death as a release from his sufferings. Even when the boat had arrived at the pier, he still remained in the berth he had occupied all night, and would probably have continued to lie there had not the steward lifted him by main force to his feet. He seized his black bag with a groan, and staggered on deck. Here he felt a little better, but new terrors seized him at the sight of the gold-laced officials and blue-bloused porters, who lined each side of the gangway, all talking at the top of their voices, and in tones which seemed, to his unaccustomed ear, to convey a thirst for British blood. No sooner had he landed than he was accosted by a ferocious-looking personage, in truth, a harmless custom-house officer, who asked him in French whether he had anything to declare, and made a movement to take his bag in order to mark it as passed. Quelch jumped to the conclusion that the stranger was a brigand bent on depriving him of his property, and he held on to the bag with such tenacity that the douanier naturally inferred there was something specially contraband about it. He proceeded to open it, and produced, among sundry other feminine belongings, a lady's frilled and feather-load nightdress, from which, as he unrolled it, fell a couple of bundles of cigars. Benjamin's look of astonishment as he saw these unexpected articles produced from his handbag was interpreted by the officials as a look of guilt. As a matter of fact, half stupefied by the agonies of the night, he had forgotten the precise spot where he had left his own bag, and had picked up in its stead one belonging to the wife of a sporting gentleman on his way to some races at Longchamps. Desiring to smuggle a few weeds, and deeming that the presence of such articles would be less likely to be suspected among a lady's belongings, the sporting gentleman had committed them to his companion's keeping. Handbags, as a rule, are passed unopened, and such would probably have been the case in the present instant had not Quelch's look of panic excited suspicion. The real owners of the bag had picked up Quelch's, which it precisely resembled, and were close behind him on the gangway. The lady uttered an exclamation of dismay as she saw the contents of her bag spread abroad by the customs officer, but was promptly silenced by her husband. "Keep your blessed tongue quiet," he whispered. "If a blooming idiot chooses to sneak our bag, and then to give himself away to the first man that looks at him, he must stand the racket." Whereupon the sporting gentleman and lady, first taking a quiet peep into Benjamin's bag to make sure that it contained nothing compromising, passed the examiner with a smile of conscious innocence, and, after an interval for refreshment at the buffet, took their seats in the train for Paris. Meanwhile poor Quelch was taking before a pompous individual with an extra-large moustache and a double allowance of gold lace on his cap, and charged not only with defrauding the revenue, but with forcibly resisting an officer in the execution of his duty. The accusation being in French, Quelch did not understand a word of it, and in his ignorance took it for granted that he was accused of stealing the strange bag and its contents. Visions of imprisonment, penal servitude, nay, even capital punishment, floated before his bewildered brain. Finally, the official with the large moustache made a speech to him in French, setting forth that for his dishonest attempt to smuggle he must pay a fine of 100 francs. With regard to the assault on the official, as said official was not much hurt, he graciously agreed to throw that in and make no charge for it. When he had fully explained matters to his own satisfaction, he waited to receive the answer of the prisoner, but none was forthcoming, for the best of reasons. It finally dawned on the official that Quelch might not understand French, and he therefore proceeded to address him in what he considered to be his native tongue. "You smoggle seeger? Sen it must that you pay amend. 100 francs. You me understand? 100 francs. Pay, pay, pay." At each repetition of the last word he brought down a dirty fist into the palm of the opposite hand immediately under Quelch's nose. 100 francs, English money, 400. Quelch caught the last words, and was relieved to find that it was merely a money payment that was demanded of him. But he was little better off, for, having but a few shillings in his pocket, to pay £4 was as much out of his power as if it had been 400. He determined to appeal to the mercy of his captors. "Not got," he said, apologetically, with a vague idea that by speaking very elementary English he came somehow nearer to French. "That all," he continued, producing his little store and holding it out beseechingly to the official. "Paris is not enough," growled the latter. Quelch tried again in all his pockets, but only succeeded in finding another threepenny piece. The officer shook his head. and, after a brief discussion with his fellows, said, "Comment vous appelez-vous, monsieur? How do you call yourself?" With a vague idea of keeping his disgrace from his friends, Quelch rashly determined to give a false name. If he had had a few minutes to think it over, he would have invented one for the occasion. But his imagination was not accustomed to such sudden calls, and, on the question being repeated, he desperately gave the name of his next-door neighbour, Mr. Henry Fladgate. "Henry Fladgate," repeated the officer, as he wrote it down. "Et vous demeurez? You live where?" And Quelch proceeded to give the address of Mr. Fladgate. 11 Primrose Terrace. "Très bien. I send telegram. Au violon." And poor Benjamin was ignominiously marched to the local police station. Meanwhile, Quelch's arrangements at home were scarcely working as he had intended. The estimable Mrs. Widger, partly by reason of her deafness and partly of native stupidity, had only half understood his instructions about the letters. She knew she was to stamp them, and she knew she was to post them, but the dates in the corners might have been runic inscriptions for any idea they conveyed to her obfuscated intellect. Accordingly, the first time she visited her usual house of call, which was early on the morning of Good Friday, she proceeded, in her own language, to get the dratted things off her mind, by dropping them both into the nearest pillar-box. On the following day, therefore, Mrs. Quelch, at Lowestoft, was surprised to find on the breakfast table 2 letters in her Benjamin's handwriting. Her surprise was still greater when, on opening them, she found one to be a graphic account of a visit to the Zoological Gardens on the following Monday. The conclusion was obvious. Either Benjamin had turned prophet and had somehow got ahead of the almanac, or he was carrying on in some very underhand manner. Mrs. Quelch decided for the latter alternative, and determined to get to the bottom of the matter at once. She cut a sandwich, put on her bonnet, and grasping her umbrella in a manner which boded no good to anyone who stayed her progress, started by the next train for Liverpool Street. On reaching home she extracted from the weeping Widger, who had just been spending the last of Benjamin's 5 shillings, and was far gone in depression and gin and water, that her good gentleman had not been home since Thursday night. This was bad enough, but there was still more conclusive evidence that he was up to no good, in the shape of his tall hat, which hung, silent accuser, on the last peg in the passage. Having pumped Mrs. Widger till there was no more, save tears, to be pumped out of her, Mrs. Quelch, still firmly grasping her umbrella, proceeded next door, on the chance that her neighbour, Mrs. Fladgate, might be able to give her some information. She found Mrs. Fladgate weeping in the parlour with an open telegram before her. Being a woman who did not stand upon ceremony, she read the telegram, which was dated from Dieppe, and ran as follows: "Monsieur Fladgate, here detained for to have smuggled cigars. Fine to pay, 100 franc. Send money and he will be released." "Oh, the men, the men!" ejaculated Mrs. Quelch, as she dropped into an armchair. "They're all alike. First Benjamin, and now Fladgate. I shouldn't wonder if they had gone off together." "You don't mean to say Mr. Quelch has gone too?" sobbed Mrs. Fladgate. "He has taken a shameful advantage of my absence. He has not been home since Thursday evening, and his hat is hanging up in the hall." "You don't think he has been murdered?" "I'm not afraid of that," replied Mrs. Quelch. "It wouldn't be worth anybody's while. But what has he got on his head? That's what I want to know. Of course, if he's with Mr. Fladgate in some foreign den of iniquity, that accounts for it. Don't foreigners wear hats?" inquired Mrs. Fladgate, innocently. "Not the respectable English sort, I'll bet bound," replied Mrs. Quelch. "Some outlandish rubbish, I dare say. But I thought Mr. Fladgate on his Scotch journey." Mr. Fladgate, it should be stated, was a traveller in the oil and colour line. "So he is. I mean, so he ought to be. In fact, I expected him home to-day. But now he's in prison, and I may never see him any more." And Mrs. Fladgate wept afresh. "Stuff and nonsense," retorted Mrs. Quelch. "You've only to send the money they ask for, and they'll be glad enough to get rid of him. But I wouldn't hurry. I'd let him wait a bit. You'll see him soon enough, never fear." The prophecy was fulfilled sooner than the prophet expected. Scarcely were the words out of her mouth when a cab was heard to draw up at the door, and a moment later Fladgate himself, a big jovial man, wearing a white hat very much on one side, entered the room and threw a bundle of rugs on the sofa. "Home again, old girl, and glad of it." "Morning, Mrs. Quelch," said the newcomer. Mrs. Fladgate gazed at him doubtfully for a moment, and then flung her arms round his neck, ejaculating, "Saved! Saved!" "Martha," said Mrs. Quelch, reprovingly, "have you no self-respect? Is this the way you deal so shameful a deception?" Then, turning the supposed offender, "So, Mr. Fladgate, you have escaped from your foreign prison?" "Foreign? How much? Have you both gone dotty, ladies?" "I've just escaped from a third-class carriage on the London and North Western. The space is limited, but I never heard it called a foreign prison." "It is useless to endeavour to deceive us," said Mrs. Quelch, sternly. "Look at that telegram, Mr. Fladgate, and deny it if you can. You have been gadding about in some vile foreign place with my misguided husband." "Oh, Quelch is in it too, is he? Then it must be a bad case. But let's see what we have been up to, for, 'pon my word, I'm quite in the dark at present." He held out his hand for the telegram, and read it carefully. "Somebody's been having a lark with you, old lady," he said to his wife. "You know well enough where I've been, my regular northern journey, and nowhere else." "I don't believe a word of it," said Mrs. Quelch. "You men are all alike, deceivers, every one of you." "Much obliged for your good opinion, Mrs. Quelch. I had no idea Quelch was such a bad lot. But, so far as I am concerned, the thing's easily tested. Here is the bill for my bed last night at Carlisle. Now, if I was in Carlisle and larking about at Dieppe at the same time, perhaps you'll kindly explain how I managed it." Mrs. Quelch was staggered, but not convinced. "But if you were at Carlisle, where is Benjamin, and what does this telegram mean?" "Not being a wizard, I really can't say. But concerning Quelch, we shall find him, never fear. When did he disappear?" Mrs. Quelch told her story, not forgetting the mysterious letter. "I think I see daylight," said Fladgate. "The party who has got into the mess is Quelch, and, being frightened out of his wits, he has given my name instead of his own. That's about the size of it." "But Benjamin doesn't smoke, and how should he come to be at Dieppe?" "Went for a holiday, I suppose. As for smoking, I shouldn't have thought he was up to it. But with that sat-upon sort of man, begging your pardon, Mrs. Quelch, you never know where he may break out. Worms will turn, you know, and sometimes they take a wrong turning." "But Benjamin would never dare." "That's just it. He daren't do anything when you've got your eye on him. When you haven't, perhaps he may, and perhaps he mayn't. The fact is, you hold up his head too tight, and if he jibs now and then you can't wonder at it." You have a very coarse way of putting things, Mr. Fladgate. Mr. Quelch is not a horse, that I am aware of. We won't quarrel about the animal, my dear madam, but you may depend upon it, my solution's right. A hardened villain, like myself, say, would never have got into such a scrape, but Quelch don't know enough of the world to keep himself out of mischief. They've got him in quod, that's clear, and the best thing you can do is to send the coin and get him out again. Send money to those swindling Frenchmen? Never! If Benjamin is in prison, I will fetch him out myself. You would never risk that dreadful sea passage, exclaimed Mrs. Fladgate. And how will you manage the language? You don't understand French. Oh, I shall do very well, said the heroic woman. They won't talk French to me. That same night a female passenger crossed by the boat from Newhaven to Dieppe. The passage was rough, and the passenger was very seasick, but she still sat grimly upright, never for one moment relaxing her grasp on the handle of her silk umbrella. What she went through on landing, how she finally obtained her husband's release, and what explanations passed between the reunited pair, must be left to the reader's imagination, for Mrs. Quelch never told the story. 24 hours later a four-wheeled cab drew up at the Quelch's door, and from it descended, firstly a stately female, and then a woe-begone little man, in a soft felt hat and a red necktie, both sorely crushed and soiled, with a black bag in his hand. "Is there a fire in the kitchen?" asked Mrs. Quelch the moment she set foot in the house. Being assured that there was, she proceeded down the kitchen stairs. Quelch meekly followed her. "Now," she said, pointing to the black bag, "those things." Benjamin opened the bag, and trembling took out the frilled nightdress and the cigars. His wife pointed to the fire, and he meekly laid them on it. "Now that necktie." The necktie followed the cigars. "And that thing." And the hat crowned the funeral pile. The smell was peculiar, and to the ordinary nose disagreeable, but to Mrs. Quelch it was as the odour of burnt incense. She watched the heap as it smouldered away, and finally dispersed the embers by a vigorous application of the poker. "Now, Benjamin," she said to her trembling spouse, "I forgive you, but if ever again—" The warning was left unspoken, but it was not needed. Benjamin's one experience has more than satisfied his yearning for soft raiment and foreign travel, and his hats are taller than ever. End of story.